Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Healing Home. I'm your host, Michelle, and today I am joined by Mike Williams of Sage of Quay Radio. I am very, very excited to have you today, Mike. Thank you so much for being here, and how's your day going so far?
So far, so good, and thank you for the invite, Michelle.
Yes, you're very welcome. And I want to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself for people who may not be familiar with your work, because I have been following your work for many years since I began my journey with quote unquote truther information. But typically, when I started digging into Charles Manson, the mythos of all of that, probably back in around 2013, when my whole paradigm just exploded, when I started learning about the truth behind the history of bands like the Beatles, the Doors, Neil Young, what was happening in the 60s. We could go on, but please introduce yourself for the people who may not be familiar with your work and let them know where they can find you as well.
Okay, so I've been at this a pretty long time. I started off as a blogger going back to the 2011, 2012 timeframe, and I still run the blog, Michelle. It's been, 12, 13 years. I've had to change the URL a couple of times because of censorship, but it's still there. And then in 2014, I started doing podcasting, and I created a YouTube channel, and I had never podcasted before. And two people who helped me get started were Max Egan and David Icke, believe it or not. So going back to 2014, the early part of 2014, a friend of mine had David Icke's email. And so I sent David an email and I asked him if he wouldn't mind coming on my show. I was nobody. He didn't know me from a hole in the wall. And about a week later, David responded and said, okay, I'll come on your show. And it was the same thing with Max Egan. I was listening to a lot of Max's podcasts, and I thought, let me invite Max and see if he'll come on. And the same thing happened. So I want to thank both David and Max for helping me get started. It was very beneficial because what happened was after people saw their names, whenever I reached out to somebody, they were more apt to come on the show because it had like a track record of having people on. So, that's how it works. Some people may not like that, but that's reality. That's how it works. So I have been doing the YouTube channel and now Rumble and Odyssey and Brighteon and BitChute since 2014. So that's a decade. And my podcasting, where I was the host, actually slowed up a lot once I got into the Beatle research, which was in 2016. I was still doing shows after that, but the research into the Beatles was occupying so much of my time that I had to shift gears. So since 2016, I've been heads down looking into the Beatles and what they were really all about. And I came up with some very interesting conclusions.
Yeah, great intro. And that's wonderful to hear about. I have heard you speak about that, your intro with Max Egan and David Icke. It's so cool when we look back at those things and look at those people who were the ones that were like, I'll give them a chance, and then that being the catapult person that allows you into that little network. And I think too, it is unfortunate that it is who you know, but that's just how it goes. And it'll always be that way, and it's okay. And it's like, you can hate on it or you can try and shun it all you want. But the more you do that too, you close yourself off to all these opportunities. So it's really cool. Well, I'm grateful that you stepped on this path, because I've learned a lot from your research, as has my fiance, Mario. And we both have just really, enjoyed what you come out with. And that's why you're here today. So I'm really pumped to get into the Beatles, because with the Beatles, once you start looking into their history, it's really hard to deny unless you have your fan cap on and you're unable to take that off. It's really hard to deny that their career is definitely interesting, to say the least, because the amount of records that have come out, the amount of studio time they've had, the amount of songs that were written in about what, a 10-year period, they say. How in the hell is that even possible? And you, as a musician yourself, would know exactly what it takes in order to be putting out the amount of music that they have. So, what was the first thing that really tipped you off about the Beatles that you were like, I've got to dig deeper into this and figure out what's really going on here?
Well, what I should say first is I was a huge Beatle fan. I was a Beatle freak. I grew up with the Beatles. I begged my parents to go see Yellow Submarine in 1968. So my father took my brother and I to the theater. It's because of the Beatles that I picked up a guitar, started writing music, recording, all of that. I studied Beatle music. I would listen to what they recorded, the overdubs, and I would incorporate that into my ideas about a song. And I knew about the Paul is dead rumor or conspiracy going back to when I was in high school. That's when I really became familiar with it. And that was around 1976 or so. And I was so interested in the clues. I was playing records backwards and I was looking at the album covers, looking to pick up on the clues. That what I did back on Long Island, my high school was very progressive. And if the students wanted to bring a speaker in or a presenter, you could do that. You had to get it approved and all that stuff. So I thought, well, I'm going to bring my friend Adam's brother in, Doug. And Doug is about, he was 5 years older than us, but he knew all of the Beatle clues, everything, all the backmasking, all of the album clues. So I asked Doug, would he come in and do a presentation? So he said, yeah. So he came in, and I had put all these signs up advertising that we're going to have this Paul is dead clues presentation. And I didn't expect much. I really didn't. And so they set aside a classroom. So, Doug gets there a little early. He sets up. And by the time we're ready to start, it was packed. It was standing room only to listen to Doug present the clues and play the backmasking. So that was my introduction into it. I was really into it at the time. But like most people, I thought that the Paul is dead conspiracy or the rumors was nothing more than a marketing ploy to pump up more record sales. And the Beatles have always been sold to us as these clever, witty guys. And so it was a clever, witty thing that they did. And so for the longest time, I knew about the rumor, but I just said, no, there's no way. So then what happened in 2016, the early part of 2016, I was on Amazon and I was looking for books, and Amazon recommends this book, The Memoirs of Billy Shears, which I knew nothing about. So I click on it and I read a little bit about the book. There's a little bit of a write-up. So I said, okay, well, this looks interesting. Let me take a look. It's about the Paul is dead conspiracy. And so I bought the book and I started reading it. And when I started reading it, I was just blown away because it's a narrative that is 180 degrees apart from the official narrative. So everything that we were told about the Beatles from an official narrative perspective was completely turned on its head. So I'm reading this book and I'm thinking, oh, this is very strange. And the thing that caught my attention was there was so much detail in the book that I thought to myself, the only way this much information and detail can make its way into this book is it has to be written by somebody who is either part of the inner circle or the person that is playing the part of Paul McCartney. And so what I did was I started to break down what was presented in the book, the statements it was making. And I thought, well, let me go off and see if I can debunk what it's telling me in the book. Is it truthful or is it not truthful? So to make a long story short, over the years, I have found that although the book does have threads of fiction in it, it's classified as historical fiction, and it does that for plausible deniability. And that's because the person that's playing Paul McCartney, I refer to him as Billy Shears, he has signed contracts, NDAs, secrecy agreements to play this part. And so he can't completely spill the beans, but what he can do is to put information out there under the guise of historical fiction with plausible deniability, and then leave it up to the intrepid reader how far they want to go with the book. And it's a Masonic book. And what I mean by that is the author or the encoder is Thomas Hugh Harriot. And Tom is a Freemason. And Tom has the book layered. So there's various layers to the book. So what do I mean by that? It means you can just read the book as is, and you're going to get information from it. Then there's a piece of encoding that's called word stacking. So on each page of the book, there are bolded out letters. I should say bolded out words. Once you read those words, more of the story starts to come out. So there are sentences or narratives within the narrative. Then there's another layer that's called the acrostical code. So the acrostical code takes the first letter of every other sentence and forms additional sentences. So now you have more information. In 2018, Tom Hugh Harriot added footnotes. And the footnotes were placed in the book, I was told, because the person who's playing the part of Paul McCartney, Billy Shears, wanted the book to get more traction. He wanted more people to become aware of the book and to also break through some of the encoding or the coyness of the book. So you'll read certain sentences and you'll think to yourself, well, what exactly does that mean? And you'll have to sit and pause for a moment and think about it. But with the 2018 version, a lot of that guesswork was taken out because Tom added footnotes, which were very clear about what those particular passages or narratives were talking about in the book. Another piece of layering is the book asks the reader, if they decide to, like I said, be intrepid, to go outside the book and to do research, and then take your research outside the book and tie it back to where the book was leading you or suggesting that you go or look at. And that's what I did when I took a look at whether they wrote all their own music or not. Recently, there's another layer, and it's referred to as the whisper messages. So at the very top or the side of each page, or almost all of the pages, I don't think it's on every page of the book. The book is 666 pages and 66 chapters. So we have a little bit of occultism going on there. But these whisper messages are written in very faint font. So, I had to actually take a magnifying glass, as ridiculous as this sounds, and read the whisper messages. And now we're getting more information. So that's how the book works. So think of it, the way I've described it on other shows is think of it as a gigantic puzzle. And you're presented with this puzzle. And you put it together. And the more pieces that you're able to fit together, the more you're going to understand that what the book is telling us overall is truthful. There, like I said, there are threads of nonfiction. So part of the process is to figure out, well, which pieces of the book are the fictional aspects of the book versus the nonfiction. So what happened was, as I was going through this book and reading it, Sophia Smallstone was a friend of mine, and back in 2016, I told her, I've got this book. It's very interesting. I'm not really sure where to go with it, but I started to explain to her what the book was saying, and she said, "Well, why don't you come on my show and do a presentation on the book?" And I resisted for the longest time, Michelle, because the book is 666 pages, and I knew in order to break that book down, there was going to be a tremendous amount of work. Like I had to build a PowerPoint. I had to think through what are the categories, the subcategories, and tie it all out. And I thought to myself, do I really, really want to do this? So Sophia was very persistent, as she is. And finally, I said, fine, I'll do it. And so I went on her show in September of 2016. And I think we did 2 or 2.5 hours and we presented it. And I really thought that was going to be it. I really had no other plans to go any further with the book. I thought, okay, fine, I did it. Now let's move on. And then Mark Devlin reached out to me after watching the show I did with Sophia. And Mark said, hey, Mike, would you come on my show and talk about it? I said, okay, I'll come on your show and talk about it. And toward the end of that show, I said to Mark, well, this is going to be the last interview I'm going to do on the Beatles and this book. And that's documented. That's kind of etched in stone and famous last words. And, it's just one of those things, Michelle. There's so much to it. There are so many touch points. And it goes deep into the agenda that we're seeing playing out today, which really started in earnest going back into the 1950s, but really in the 1960s with the counterculture. And the thing is, you don't realize that at first. And as I mentioned, when you put more and more of the pieces of the puzzle in place, you start to think to yourself, okay, all right, well, now, this leads back over here. And so then you go take a look over here, and another piece of the story starts to emerge. And so here I am in 2024, 8 years into this, and still talking about it and still looking into it. I did say on a show I did with Billy Watson recently that I think that I may wrap it up maybe next year. Right now, we're in a very early stages, concept phase of a documentary that Jay Widener asked me to help him with on the Beatles' unofficial story. And so I'm working on the outline right now as we speak for that documentary. And I also had to reach out to some of my colleagues to see if they were interested in participating. I didn't want the documentary to be me because there are other researchers out there that have done fabulous work. Many of them are colleagues and friends of mine. And I wanted them to present their material as well because I didn't want it to be the Mike show. Because to be the Mike show, well, somebody can just interview me, or I can put a presentation together myself and put it up on my platforms and do it that way. So maybe next year I might ride out into the sunset. But every time I say that, something else pops up. But in any case, that's the background. The book, what happens is you start with the replacement of Paul McCartney. Paul McCartney was swapped out at the end of 1966. There are 3 dates you're going to come across. August, some researchers will say it was August, after their concert at Candlestick Park. The book tells us unequivocally it was September 11th of 1966. That's the date I lean toward because of its occult significance. Others will say that it was November 9th, which is the inverse of September 11th. But I'll go with the book because the book is very emphatic. The date is September 11th. And then what happens is once you figure out that Paul was indeed swapped out, then you start down the path, well, why? Why did that happen? Why was it done in secrecy? And what was the story leading up to September 11th of 1966. See, a lot of what a lot of researchers do, and I'm not knocking them because this is an important piece. It is important to understand that Paul was swapped out, that he was replaced. But to start there and only move forward is only playing half the football field. There's a whole lot that took place before that, as in, why were the Beatles created?
Right.
How did they come about? What was their purpose? So, and that's the piece I got into. And that's the piece that gets me into a lot of hot water with fans, other researchers, because a lot of researchers, although, like I said, they've done some very good work, they don't want to touch that piece of the story because they still love what I refer to as the Cinderella story.
Mm.
Four lads from Liverpool. They connect with Brian Epstein, who's a record store manager, owner, and then he's able to get them a recording contract with EMI under the tutelage of George Martin, and then they go on to unprecedented fame and fortune. I mean, that's a fabulous story. Who doesn't like it? I loved it for the longest time. But as I dug in, that story is exactly that. It's a story. And there's a lot of other information and a lot of other pieces to that puzzle that a lot of people don't know about or pay attention to, or if they hear it, it goes right over their heads because the official narrative is so indoctrinated that anything that cuts across the grain is just set aside. And we have to remember, as of today in 2024, the Beatles' official narrative has been around for 60 years. That's a long time to have something constantly pounded into your head. So anyway, long-winded, but there you go.
No, it's beautiful. I love it. I'm here for it, man. And okay, so one of the things that I think about, well, first off, I have to say whisper messages. I've never even heard of that term in a book. So
Right.
now it makes me think about how many other books out there have these whisper messages in there. And so you can see it with your plain eyes, but it's like wispy and small.
Very light font. Very light
Wow.
font. And Tom put them in the book um, as another layer. And also, and I'm sure we'll get into this, but there's a very esoteric story behind the Beatles. Very esoteric, which goes over the heads of a lot of people because they don't know anything about the esoteric or mysticism or
Right.
Aleister Crowley and Thelema. And honestly, that's exactly how the controllers want it. They don't want people to know about this. And we'll get into this as I talk some more. But the Beatles are tied back to cultural Marxism and the Frankfurt School.
Yeah.
And we'll talk about that.
Yes. Wow. Well, hey, okay. So, what do you think was presented to the other members when they swapped out Paul for Billy? How do you think that went down? Or were they even unaware? Was it like, what's your opinion on that?
Well, they were aware. And I'll take you through my opinion on how it went down. The person that replaced Paul McCartney, Billy Shears, he has the primary contract. There have been doubles and lookalikes, and Billy mentions in the book that there was another person who played the role of Paul McCartney that had a hit. But he doesn't say whether it's a Beatle hit or it's post-Beatles as Paul McCartney, as in the solo career. So I believe, based upon my research, reading the book, taking a look how I believe things would work logically, Billy has been involved in the band for a long time, going back to, I believe, its inception as early as 1962. In the book, he tells us that he was a studio musician, and one of his skills was vocal mimicry. So he would be hired to come in and sing like famous singers. If that particular singer couldn't make the session, maybe they were not feeling well, voice wasn't doing well, they would call Billy in to go do the vocals. So I believe he was part of the equation the whole time. I believe in all likelihood, I think there's a high probability that he was one of the studio musicians that was uh, on the Beatles recordings. Whether he was, he's a horn, a wind, I should say, a wind and keyboard piano player by trade.
Okay.
Okay, but he's a multi instrumentalist, so he can obviously play guitar, play bass, and so when George Martin was pulling together the Beatles songs, and then the songs written for the Beatles, and then bring in the studio musicians, I'm convinced that Billy was a constant in those sessions. So whether he was playing in the orchestra or he was playing some wind instrument, the piano, guitar, bass, or whatever, he was there. So the reason why I'm taking you through this is because if that's the case, and I believe it is, then the other Beatles knew who he was. So he wasn't this stranger that just popped in September of 1966. So he was making the rounds through different studios, EMI being one of them as a studio musician. And I do believe that George Martin tapped him to play on certain songs. So the other thing that we have to get our heads wrapped around, and I had to do this as well, all of the Beatles were Freemasons. So how do we know this? Because we can go back in time and we can see multitudes of images and photos that were taken of the Beatles, whether as a group or individually, where they are engaged in Masonic symbolism. The Masonic handshake, the lion's paw, one-eyed symbolism, lots and lots of imagery. Birdcage, the birdcage goes to Illuminati mind control. We can get into that in a little bit. So this is important because if the Beatles were Freemasons, and I believe they were, that's a secret society that keeps its secrets to itself. Now, some people will argue, well, they weren't high degree Masons at that age, 19, 20, 21, 22 years old. And that's probably the case, but it doesn't matter because Masons have obligations. They take their oaths and they're bound by those oaths, period. So I think that when Paul was replaced, and I do lean toward Paul passing away, dying. Other people believe that he just stepped out. I don't see any proof of that, to be honest with you. I've taken a look at many, many, many images post 1966, and I haven't really come across anything that wasn't doctored that looks like the original biological Paul. So I believe Paul did pass away in 1966. So when it came time to keep the Beatles together, and Billy was brought in again. Now, Billy wasn't just dragged off the streets and said, hey, you look like him, you play like him, you sound like him, because this is kind of the questions you get from those that don't believe the story or don't want to believe it. Oh, how did they find somebody that looked like him, sounded like him, and plays like him? Well, the truth of the matter is none of those things are true. He doesn't look like Paul. He really doesn't sing like Paul.
Right.
And he's a different instrumentalist than Paul. He has a different style of playing than Paul did. The only reason why people believe that he looks like him, he sounds like him, he plays like him, and all that, it goes back to what I said before. He's been Paul McCartney for 60 years. That's who you're used to seeing. That's who you are used to hearing. And so he's Paul McCartney. As an example, just to give the audience a kind of a baseline, take a look at early video of biological Paul pre-1966 going back to 62 and 63 performing live. And take a look at how Paul plays his bass, his stance. his body movements. Fast forward to the rooftop scene in Get Back in January of 1969, and take a look at that guy and notice his posture and his stance when he's playing. It's completely different, not even remotely the same. They are two different people. So the Beatles were well aware that they were manufactured and that they had a job to do. Now, their understanding of the big picture was limited. It's compartmentalized.
Right.
Okay, so that's not to say that they had the full spectrum or the full scope of where the controllers were going with all this. But they knew they had a role, they knew they had a part, they knew they were trained to do this role. And a lot of that training goes back to Hamburg. We'll talk about that if we have time, what Hamburg was all about. So when Paul departed, I'm going to assume there was a discussion that said the show must go on.
Right.
And the new guy is that guy that you guys have seen hanging around here. Okay. And possibly working with George Martin, even before 1967 and with Sgt. Pepper, because Sgt. Pepper was really the George Martin and Billy Shear's show. That was their baby. So that's what I think happened. And it's not to say that the original Beatles were not mourning or upset about the fact that Paul died and Paul was replaced. They just couldn't really go anywhere with it. And although there were clues that were dropped by each individual Beatle over the course of time, especially in their solo careers. So John Lennon released a song on the Imagine album, How Do You Sleep? How Do You Sleep is the quintessential Paul is Dead song. And if you read memoirs and then you go listen to John's song, How Do You Sleep? There's direct linkages. The song and the book map. Ringo Starr did a song, Back Off Boogaloo. Now, the book tells us that the Beatles used to call Billy Boogaloo because he liked that genre of music. So when Ringo is singing Back Off Boogaloo, he's singing Back Off Billy. Because Billy, in the book, if people read it, you'll understand that he's very driven. His work ethic is just go, 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 and he's a perfectionist. This is not something that the other Beatles were, they were not used to working that way. And we'll get into the music in a bit. The Beatles' music from 62 through 66 in particular, I concluded based upon my research, they wrote very little, if any, of that music, which means the songs were written for them, which means George Martin then brought in studio musicians, and we could talk about Rubber Soul, because Rubber Soul, in my opinion, is the silver bullet that really puts the cap on this. So studio musicians recorded the songs, and so when the Beatles came into the studio, their job was not to write music. Their job was not to record the music because the songs were already written and recorded. Their job was to sing the vocals. That was their job. That's a very, very different job than being involved in the actual songwriting, in the arrangement of a song, and putting it all together. So when Billy came into the picture, starting with the recording of Sgt. Pepper, what he did was he brought them more into the fold, whereas George Martin kept everything basically to outside songwriters and studio musicians. When Billy came in, he wanted to open that up to John Lennon and George Harrison in particular, so that they could be participate more in the songwriting and play more on the recorded tracks. So think of Billy as actually developing them to become songwriters, or much better songwriters, and to also play on the recorded tracks. Now, that being said, the Billy period goes from 1967 to 1970. The biological Paul period is 62 through 66. Even though Billy brought them into the fold, and this is, in my opinion, this is particularly evident with the White Album. Because Pepper, Sergeant Pepper was the Billy and George Martin show. Pepper was very, very important because Sergeant Pepper kicked off the Summer of Love. It was the beginning, the true beginning of the psychedelic period. So the Beatles established that foundation, that baseline. In fact, in an interview, I believe it was in 1990, Billy, as Paul McCartney, sat down and had an interview with Bernie Goldberg. And during that interview, Billy told Bernie that George Harrison was essentially a no-show for the Sgt. Pepper recording sessions. That George Harrison was at home putting in a pool or something. That's a quote from the interview. So why am I bringing that up? I'm bringing that up because that's to show that George Harrison was credited for the guitar work on the Sgt. Pepper album. But here we have an interview with Billy speaking to Bernie Goldberg and saying, well, George Harrison wasn't there. So it begs the question, well, if George wasn't there, then who's playing guitar on those tracks? My guess is a lot of it was done by Billy himself. And of course, they can always bring in a studio guitar player and then credit the tracks back to George Harrison. But it's with the White Album that we start to really get this eclectic collection of songs. And a lot of people, a lot of Beatle fans and critics will say it's a great album, but it's a hodgepodge of styles.
Yep.
It's
And
eclectic.
and particularly for the time, because,
Yes.
and that is always a big giveaway. And I'm glad we're going to the White Album because it obviously brings us closer even to like the Manson mythos that is mixed in with all of this.
Yeah.
And that's where a lot of my interest lies within Manson. And I'm of the belief too that the Beatles were thrown into the Manson mix as kind of this weird sort of, that's the mainstream narrative. Okay. They were listening to the Beatles and they were influenced by the White Album. And that's why they wrote Helter Skelter. And that's why there's Piggies and this and that. I do think that that's part of the whole kind of CIA sort of MK Ultra underlyingness of the Manson stuff, but it just always just interests me that these two blend together so well because just that whole thing of the times of the Beatles kind of like ushering in the Summer of Love, and then you have the Beatles kind of bringing it to the close, because in my opinion the Manson murders were kind of the quintessential close of the Summer of Love. You talk to people, even I can remember talking to my grandparents about how it felt, and they lived in Wisconsin, not in LA, but how everyone locked their doors after this period of time and
Yeah.
everything else. So that's just something that's coming to mind that I want to throw into the mix with the White Album anyway.
Yeah. In the book, Billy distances himself and the band from Manson. Just so people know that. So I do think that the Beatles and the Manson story were glued together by the controllers. That to create a narrative, like you said, Michelle. So in any case, so what we have from 67 to 70, where Billy is the de facto handler, manager, leader of the band, is the Beatles writing more of their own stuff, playing more on the recorded tracks. However, ghostwriters were still being used to fill out the material for an album, and session musicians were still being used. As an example, one of the songs that I point out that just does not sound like the Beatles at all, and it just sounds like a crack team of session players is Lady Madonna.
Interesting.
Okay. Also on the White Album, we'll talk a bit about Theodore Adorno and the Frankfurt School, but on the White Album, if we listen, another example that I put out there for folks to listen to is to show a song that was, in all likelihood, written by George Harrison and credited to him, and another song that was written for George Harrison and credited to him. Two different things. One he wrote, one he didn't, but the credits go to him. If you listen to the song Long, 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 I could listen to that song and I could think to myself, you know, I could easily get comfortable with saying George penned that song. He wrote that song. It's not overly complicated. You know, in fact, I think the song is a little draggy. You know, not one of my favorite songs, but be that as it may, because there are good, look, liking music is very subjective. There are going to be people that are going to say, Mike, you're crazy. I love that song. But then switch over to Piggies. And you have this Baroque, it's orchestral, and the lyrics are right down Theodore Adorno's avenue, right down the thought processes of the Frankfurt School of critical theory and cultural Marxism. Now, did George write that song? No, I don't think so. I think that song was, in all likelihood, was composed by Theodore Adorno, both the music and the lyrics, and George got to sing the song. So we'll get more into this, and I'll explain more why that is meaningful. But the takeaway at this point is that the Beatles, the story, is so different than what we have been told. Very, very different. Because we were told that they were these brilliant, genius songwriters. They were prolific, great musicians, even though they themselves have never said they were great musicians. That's the interesting thing. That's one of the most interesting pieces of this whole thing. The story has gotten its own legs where people will say the Beatles were brilliant musicians. But then if you go back to interviews that, especially Paul McCartney was brutally honest in two interviews going back to 1966. In June of 1966 at the Hilton in Japan, and in a BBC interview that he did with John Lennon at his house on August 5th of 1966, the day that Revolver was released, their seventh studio album. And in those interviews, Paul says, we never claimed to be great musicians. We're limited as a group. At the Hilton, he said, we're adequate. We're adequate musicians. So that's an example of how the band itself was putting the truth out in front of everybody and saying, look, we're not great musicians. We're adequate at best. We're limited. But then the mythos is that they are these spectacular, great musicians, creative geniuses. So there's a lot of stuff like that. We'll get into it, I guess, I hope, when we talk about George Martin and George Martin's impressions of the band when he first met them back in 1962. A lot of George's statements were not very flattering. And these things that George said in interviews, it's out there in the public domain. They're out there. It's not secret stuff, but people disregard it. Anytime it cuts across the grain, it cuts across the official narrative or the Cinderella story. There's like these programs that run that filter that stuff out and says, does not compute.
Right.
Does not. Danger, danger, Will Robinson. Don't listen to that Mike Williams. You know? Don't listen to George Martin in that interview, right? So there's a lot of stuff like that. We have time, like I said, I'll take you through an article that was written in New Music Express back in 1971, where they interviewed their engineer for their first 6 albums, Norman Smith. The things that Norman said were not very flattering.
I hope you're enjoying this current episode with Mike Williams. Wanted to pop in really quick, you guys, to let you know that I still have some of my mugwort skincare products available. I have my Earthy Glow facial oil, my mugwort Earth Hag soap, and my mugwort and rose facial toner. All three of these have really been lovely, and I really worked hard to correspond with Venus for this offering. I went with the Venus correspondence of mugwort to harness that beauty, that lusciousness, that just wonderful earthy energy that comes from mugwort. It is heavily infused into these products along with the love of Venus and my love for mugwort. You can feel it in these products, and it really goes a long way. And if you're wanting to nourish and love your skin, this is a really great way to do it. So head to michelleshealinghome.com, head to the store tab, and you can get your hands on some of these remedies. Now, back to the show.
I don't know. So I don't want to bog your show down here with some of this minutia. Is there anything anywhere in particular you wanted to go?
I mean, no, you're not bogging it down at all, really. And so I guess to me, I want to talk a little bit about what are some of the current threads that you're pulling at with this? So you've been researching this for many years. Is there anything right now that is like an updated information that you're coming across, or new conclusions that you're finding about with this information, or what, anything else like that?
The information today is, in my opinion, validating my conclusions or my thoughts on what the Beatles were all about. So if we go back in time and we talk about the Frankfurt School, working with Tavistock,
Mm-hmm.
and before that we had the Fabian Society. So we have this cultural Marxism within the elite mindset that converged, and that convergence took place under Tavistock, the Tavistock Institute.
Yeah, let's go into this a little bit, because I know a lot of people out there will probably be familiar with Tavistock, or at least they've heard of it. But let's talk a little bit about how big of a role this plays in everything, and not only the Beatles, but let's jump into that side of it.
Okay, so the best place to start is to understand that the elite ideology is one that says that they know better, that they need to control humanity, because humanity left to its own devices will fall flat on its face. They refer to us as being profane. They look at us as not very intelligent, not very smart. We're not intellectuals. This is the elite mindset. And this elite mindset comes under the umbrella of Freemasonry. So think of Freemasonry as the overarching entity that underneath it contains a federation of secret societies that all work together. So that means that there's a Jesuit control system, there's obviously a Masonic control system, there's a Rosicrucian control system, there is a Jewish control system, there are Templars from the Knights Templar. They all work in conjunction with each other. And many of them belong to different secret societies as well. So what they have undertaken, and it's been in place for a very, very long time. And by the way, my research has shown me that it goes back to the Egyptian mysteries and the Egyptian mythology of Osiris, Isis, Horus, and Set. It goes back to Babylon, back to the priesthood and the Babylonian mysteries. But it also goes back to other mythologies, such as going back to Greece and Rome. In John Coleman's book, in the Committee of 300, he tells us that the committee, which is comprised of elites, some of them coming from the families of the black nobility, which trace their roots back to ancient Rome, they refer to themselves as the Olympians, the gods. So this is the position that they place themselves. So they have dominion over us. This is how they think. And this is how they operate. This is their ideology. So we have to understand that. So what they're looking to do is to implement a socialist, Marxist world order. So when we talk about the New World Order, the one world government, that's what they're looking to do. And it's pagan based. If you read John Coleman's book on Freemasonry, he tells us that the Masons want nothing to do with Christianity, even though they will play the game that they are accepting of Christianity and the Holy Bible is in their lodge. They are anti-Christian, as are, if not maybe all of these secret societies that I was just talking about, because they're pagan based. And when I talk about this, Michelle, and to the audience, I'm not anti-pagan. I'm not anti-Christian. When I talk about this stuff, I'm putting it within the context of my research. So just take it at that level. I'm not being pro-Christian. I'm not being pro-pagan or anti-Christian or anti-pagan. It just is what it is based upon what I've researched. So they're looking for this, they will tell us that they're looking for this altruistic, egalitarian world where everything is equal, everything is good. There's no more war, there's no more poverty, there's none of that stuff. We're going to save the environment. I look at this and I think to myself, well, are they really being altruistic? Are they really egalitarian? Or are they gaslighting us? Okay. They're gaslighting us, because we have to understand that the very system that they are telling us is of no use is a system that they created. Okay, so they built the mousetrap. And what do I mean by that? So they're responsible for the Industrial Revolution that took place back in England in the 1700s. And then they had the American Industrial Revolution that kicked off in the 1800s. It went through, the war up through around 1940 and 1945. So they built a system that they knew was going to dominate people's lives, that people were going to depend on. So as an example, what's a good example of this? Many, many years ago, there were lots of small shops, sole proprietors, entrepreneurs, small business owners. They're very methodical in what they do. In fact, the Fabians are the poster child for this. They do things very incrementally, very methodically, so that you are unaware that these things are taking place. It's like the boiling frog phenomenon.
Right.
Okay. So think about it. So they create the corporate structure. And if we go back to the March 2020 event, what they did was they moved a disproportionate number of people, employment-wise, into their corporate matrix. So they shut down small businesses, they shut down sole proprietors. They've been doing this for a very long time. In fact, I remember reading reports years ago where federal loans for small businesses were not going to small businesses. They were funneling that money off to the big corporations, the multinational corporations. They didn't want to develop small business because they didn't want independence. They didn't want people to be resilient, resourceful, and individuals. So the mousetrap was, we're going to build this industrial base. People are going to go work in our factories. They're going to go work in our corporations. And at some point, we're going to be able to leverage that. One of the ways they leveraged it was with C19. I don't know if this is going on YouTube, so I'll use code words.
Yeah, perfect. Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Because they knew now that even though we still had people in small businesses and so on, a huge portion of the population worked in their system, in the corporate system, and they could put the mandates through. And they could tell you, if you don't do this, you don't pick up a paycheck. So think about this in terms of a lot of stuff that has taken place. Because people will ask me, they'll say, well, you know, why would they tear down their system? Because it doesn't matter to them. They're here. They have their wealth and control no matter what. No matter what system is in place, they're calling the shots. Ultimately, what they're looking to do is to bring the entire world back into the feudal system. And I've been saying this for a long time. The feudal system never went away. It just got more technically advanced.
Mm.
So if you don't think you live in the feudal system, think about the fact that your taxes, you're being taxed all the time for everything. And if you're not getting taxed, well, you're getting surcharges. And there are registration fees. They're always trying to steal your wealth. Always. So if we go back in time, we have the Frankfurt School, and the Frankfurt School engaged in what was called critical theory. And we had Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, Erich Fromm, and Herbert Marcuse. They were the four primary players with the Frankfurt School. And they were looking to implement cultural Marxism. Cultural Marxism is different than Lenin Marxism. Think of Karl Marx as he's the theoretician. Then you have Lenin Marxism, which believed in using force to make change. The Bolsheviks in Russia as an example. And in fact, after World War I, the Bolsheviks were convinced that the workers were going to stand up. I don't know if people remember this, but the old slogan for communism was "Workers unite with the fist." Well, the workers didn't unite, and so they had to go back to the drawing board and figure out what the heck is going on here. This was supposed to ignite, a revolution, and it didn't. So you bring in the Frankfurt School, and their attitude was, you got it all wrong, okay? You can't just go in and use force and violence to make these things happen, because there are going to be repercussions. What you have to do is you have to subvert from within. You have to penetrate their institutions. And from there, you change their laws, or you disregard their laws. And now what you're doing is your revolution now is slow and methodical, but over time, you're going to change it. So critical theory, the way I explain it is, what Adorno and Max Horkheimer and Erich Fromm and Herbert Marcuse were doing was they were taking a look at the existing structures in society. And they would then be critical of it. They would criticize it and say, well, that's not really good. You think it's good, right? Yeah, I think this is fine. As an example, the mother staying home with the children, being the homekeeper.
Yep.
Dad goes off to work, right? Critical theory would turn around and say, why are you as a woman accepting that role? Don't you understand that's a patriarchal role that has been put upon you? It's been imposed on you. Nothing says that you need to do that. So we need to have women's rights, the women's movement, to pull the woman out of the house, out of the home, away from the children, into careers. And so when that happened, then the children, what are you going to do with the children? Now the children have to go someplace, they have to go to daycare or preschool or after school. In other words, they become wards of the state in a way. So that, when I look at critical theory, those were the types of things that they were doing. Whereas many moms and women who had children were, hey, I'm okay traditionally to stay home, take care of the children, take care of the household, as the father, the man, went off to work. A big thing with the Frankfurt School was they were always dumping on the male, the masculine aspect of society. They called it the patriarchy. Oh, do away with the patriarchy. The world would be a better place if it was more feminine. Now, I'm not saying that, the matriarchal aspects of a woman doesn't have, obviously, good character traits and things that we could bring in, and that would make the world a better place. But it's a balance, right? It's a balance.
Yes.
And it's up to each individual to make a decision as to how they want to operate their household. But what they were trying to do was, no, they don't want you making that decision. What they wanted was to just turn the switch and switch it. Get the mother out of the house. Get both parents out working. The children then would be, like I said, wards of the state, because somebody had to watch them if mom and dad were at home. So that's just one example of critical theory. Here's a quote from Max Horkheimer, who was one of the founders of the Frankfurt School, and he's talking about the Marxist revolution, cultural Marxism. The revolution won't happen with guns. Rather, it will happen incrementally, year by year, generation by generation. We will gradually infiltrate their educational institutions and their political offices, transforming them slowly into Marxist entities as we move toward universal egalitarianism. That's what they're looking for. Now, as a precursor to the Beatles, coming out of the Frankfurt School, we had the Beat movement. Okay? So we had William S. Burroughs, Ray Kerouac, and Allen Ginsberg. Now, the one thread that we're going to see with Frankfurt and with Tavistock is there are two threads that I have picked up on. There's a psychoanalytic thread. There's a psychology thread. How to manipulate the mind. And then the other thread is hedonism. So the hedonistic part of this is to go after traditional values, traditional family values, to go after institutionalized religion. And a big, big blip on their radar was Christianity. Because like I said, if you read Coleman's book, the Freemasons want nothing to do with Christianity. They want it out of the way. In fact, in his book, he mentions that at the 26th degree of Freemasonry, that is when the Mason is told that their God is Lucifer. Up to that point, all you had to do was to have a belief in a God, a creator, source. So that's how they kind of bring it along. But I believe it was the 26th degree that John Coleman mentions that they're told, okay, so, I mean, here's the punchline. Lucifer is our God. Okay?
Yeah.
All right, so now, so you have the whole Beat movement, and it's B-E-A-T, the Beat movement. And what the Beat movement was all about was, it was about no rules. It was about cultural change. It was about hedonistic behavior, ad-libbing, freestyling, not to be bound by laws, societal norms, which they claimed were just, they didn't mean anything. Your idea of good is maybe not my idea of good. So there was kind of this moral equivalency argument that was taking place as well. Right. So that's what they were doing. And I read that John Lennon was a fan of Ray Kerouac, who was a big player within the Beat movement.
Yes, definitely.
And Billy, as Paul McCartney, collaborated with Allen Ginsberg. So we could see here that we have the Beatles tied into this Beat movement. So Beat movement, B-E-A-T. Then we have Beatles, B-E-A-T-L-E-S. So the Beatles were really a result of the Beat movement. So look at you have the Frankfurt School, we have Tavistock. They create the Beat movement. The Beat movement then segues into, we start getting into rock and roll, and it moves right into, connects itself right into the Beatles. And the Beatles also, the beetle is also the scarab beetle from Egyptian mythology, which is in reference from an Egyptian mythology perspective, is talking about enlightenment. So the Beatles are also put into a position of enlightenment. This brings in Aleister Crowley as well. So let's just for a moment, let me pause here for a second and just make a tie that maybe might not be so obvious. Crowley talked about his eons. He said back in the early 1900s, he claimed that that's when the eon of Horus was coming into play. Before that, it was the eon of Osiris. And the eon of Osiris, or the age of Pisces, was about oppression. It was about being shackled. It was about not pursuing your true or pure will. You were bound by societal dogma. And then he said, when things shift and transition over to the eon of Horus, that's when man becomes unshackled. That's when you can follow your pure and true will. So think about what Crowley is teaching, his tenets of Thelema. Thelema is his religion. And by the way, his religion was founded on April 8th of 1904. And we recently had the solar eclipse on April 8th of 2024.
Wow, yeah.
So the reason why that was played up so much in the media, my opinion, is because it was celebrating the 120th year of the religion of Thelema, which I have concluded is the primary spiritual and philosophical belief system of the controllers within the pyramid of power. Crowley's belief system plays a very, very big part in what it is they believe. And again, it's the worship of Lucifer.
Wow. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So we have the Beat movement that attaches itself to the Beatles. And so the Beatles, as a creation of Tavistock, with the strong ties back to the Frankfurt School, in particular Theodore Adorno, they were created in order to further the dismantling of traditional values and institutionalized religion. So when you think about the Beatles, it started off innocent enough, but then it quickly progresses. And what did the Beatles represent? The Beatles represent anti-establishment. They dressed very differently. The music was very different. The way they presented themselves is in interviews, they were quippy. They would push back at the reporters, what would be perceived as the stagnant, stoic establishment press at the time. And going back even to some of the songs, let me just throw this out there. And by the way, when I say this, folks, I am not a prude, okay? I'm just gonna, it's something you need to think about, okay? So the Beatles' first album, released on March 22nd of 1963, March 22nd is 322. It's the Skull and Bones number. Also, it's tied back to Genesis 3:22. And the reason why it goes back to Genesis 3:22, it's because it's saying, hey, the Bible's saying, because they know this now, they could be like gods, and we can't have that. But the controlling system, they're saying, no, we're going to have that. We're going to have that. We're going to be gods. We hear it all the time. Aleister Crowley said every man and woman is a star, which means every man and woman is their own individual who develops their individuality, and then they become gods. Because in his book 77, he says, there is no God other than man. So their first album, think of the song, Please Please Me. Please please me like I please you. It's sexual innuendo. Even this very, very, very basic rock and roll song going back, it's there. There is this, it's implied, please please me like I please you. What does he mean like that? How do I please you? Well, there's many ways to please somebody, but there are ways to please somebody, right? Also, think of the song, I Saw Her Standing There. She was just 17, if you know what I mean.
Yep. Yeah, I'm so glad you brought this up, because one of the things I did leading up to our chat right now was I just started going through Paul McCartney interviews, right? He has an interview on GQ magazine, whatever, it's on YouTube. And he brings up that song and he goes, oh yeah, this was the original lyric was whatever it is. And, whatever he says it was, but she was just 17, if you know what I mean. And he said, but you guys probably don't know what I mean. And so
Right.
that's the general perception of these people, obviously in power, that people don't understand what you mean, but we do. And that's kind of the thing that's continuously been hitting me as we've been talking, is this underlying sexual innuendo through all of the programs that we see. And now we see all this gender bending, which has been pushed on everybody. That was, implied since the Beats, all of this
Yes.
stuff. You know what I mean? There's so much underlying just gender bending, and it's crazy when you look at it like that.
Sexual deviation, I'll put it that way, is very, very high on their list of things that needed to be implemented in order to dismantle the current societal structures. Here, this is Eric Fromm, is from the Frankfurt School. He said he was an active advocate of the matriarchal theory. In other words, get the man out of the way, get the masculine out of the way. Masculinity and femininity, he claimed, were not reflections of essential sexual differences, as the Romantics had thought, but were derived instead from differences in life functions, which were in part socially determined. Okay?
Wow.
So what he's saying is gender is irrelevant. You only pay attention to your gender because societal norms and traditions make you aware of them. It's really, let me just see if I have something here, Michelle. I think I have a rundown of their list of, here it is, a list of what they were going after and looking to impose into society in order to break it apart. The creation of racial differences, a racial divide. Check mark, right?
Yep.
Continual change to create confusion. The teaching of sex and homosexuality to children. The undermining of the schools and the teachers' authority. And by the way, if anybody who's interested, this is the Frankfurt School. I got this off of Henry Mackow's website. And it goes a lot deeper with a lot more links, but this is just a summary. Huge immigration to destroy identity. The thing you have to understand about the controllers, the elites, in no way are they looking to destroy their identity. Their bloodlines are preserved. So in their minds, breaking all this down, look at it as in their minds they're thinking we're going to dilute all of this. So there won't be any affinity towards your ancestral heritage or traditions.
Bingo.
Your traditions and your heritage is going to be associated with pop culture. Pop culture is the result of the Frankfurt School and Tavistock. That's the culture you have today. They created that. That's the culture that most people embrace, and that's the culture that most people live in and abide by. The promotion of excessive drinking, the emptying of churches, an unreliable legal system with bias against the victims of a crime, creating dependency on the state or state benefits, dumbing down people through the media, and encouraging the breakdown of the family.
Yep, and here we are.
and here we are. So that was the long road, a long and winding road to get to your question about what do you see today, what's going on coming out of the work. Well, in order to see what you see today coming out of the work, you have to understand the blueprint. What was the planning? Who was planning this stuff? What was the strategy? How were they going to implement the strategy? And so the music and entertainment business is a huge tool in the toolbox of the controllers. And the Beatles are a big, big tool in that toolbox. I explain to my audience that the Beatles are foundational to all of the genres that were created by the Tavistock Institute, starting with them going forward. Each genre of music, punk, glam, metal, hard rock, techno, rap, hip hop, all of that is created in order to address the next grouping, segment, or generation of people to get them conditioned to be where the controllers want the public to be. They want them marching along single file. And at the end of the day, they want a homogenized society. In memoirs, it tells us that what they're looking for at the end of the day is a population of literalists. People who believe in and abide by their ideology, their philosophies, their spiritual beliefs. And if you're not one of those people, if you're an outlier, then you're going to be a slave. And Crowley in his book 77 spells it out. Those, basically, I'm paraphrasing here, but those that are not with us shall be our slaves. Another thing I want to mention about Crowley is I get a lot of, not a lot, but every once in a while people will say, no, you're misunderstanding what Crowley's saying. What, his age of Horus is for everybody. I'm like, no, it's not for everybody. Crowley is not talking to the profane. He is not talking to the average Joe or Jane in the street. Crowley was part of the elite establishment. He worked for British intelligence back during World War I. So his religion of Thelema is talking to the elites. It's talking to the adepts. It's talking to the initiates. That's the category. That's the classification that they put themselves in. So the Beatles were a big part of changing the societal and cultural landscape. See, a lot of people have trouble with that because the Beatles have been around so long, and we've been so conditioned and indoctrinated with the Beatles story, and they've been the soundtrack to so many people's lives that it's that slow boiling frog thing. I was part of that, Michelle. I was part of that. It wasn't until I woke up and saw what was going on. But the Beatles, they brought in rock music. And after the Beatles came out, how many guys and girls went out and they formed bands, bought guitars, bought drums, bought basses, bought amplifiers. And the British invasion. So when you think about the British invasion, the world's control system, at the end of the day, makes its way back up through Britain, through London, the intercity of London, through the Crown. Where is Tavistock? Tavistock is in London. The British invasion. It's the invasion of traditional values, traditional institutionalized religion. That is what that was all about. So they created this genre of music, and it's all about presentation, Michelle.
Mikey,
So
you still here?
I'm still here. Yeah, you froze on me.
Okay. All right. I'm here too.
So I can hear you though. Okay.
Yeah.
There you go. Okay,
Okay.
We're back. Okay.
Okay.
Presentation is very important because a lot of people will argue with me and say, well, are you saying all these bands, they don't play their own music? I said, nope, never said that. I never said that. Never said that. I even said that the Beatles can play their instruments. The Beatles just weren't skilled enough to take it to the studio and be on the recorded tracks. Based upon my research, that's where I landed. But the Beatles created an entire environment of musicians that studied their music and became very good musicians. They became songwriters. They formed bands. They recorded. So it was the catalyst that got the ball rolling on all of this. And it's presentation. So when we take a look at, back in the 1960s, when I say presentation, it's the appearance. How did they dress? It's the clothing. It's the hair. It's the beards. It's the symbolism, the occult symbolism on the album covers.
Oh, yeah.
That's the presentation. It's the drugs. It's the alcohol. It's the free love. That's the presentation that was brought into everybody's living room in magazines and books, and it was everywhere in the movie theaters. That was to shape people. That was to break down the current system, the paradigms of the current social and cultural systems, and to get things going. And the Beatles were instrumental in that. And like I said earlier in the show, they brought in the psychedelic era with Sgt. Pepper and The Summer of Love. And by the way, Billy, who plays the part of Paul McCartney, along with John Phillips, was behind the Monterey Pop Festival, where the local police were told to stand down as the CIA handed out LSD to those who attended the festival. And why? Because they were experimenting. They wanted to see what would happen. So, and also, I know I'm going on a lot here, but a lot of people will say to me, well, drugs make you more creative. That's wrong. You have bought into the indoctrination, the propaganda.
Right.
If drugs were good for your creativity, then why have so many bands that got sucked into the black hole of drugs and alcohol decide to come clean? Why did they pull themselves out of that ditch if that all of that is supposed to make you more creative? That's a fallacy that you have been brainwashed to believe. In fact, in the book, Billy tells us that at his recording sessions, there is no drugs. Musicians that show up, they're clean because they have to have their faculties to make sure that the recording comes off well. So in any case.
That's a great point, actually, the whole drug thing, because ultimately, I mean, it's really just a distraction from self. And that's what all of this is. It's literally a distraction from ourselves, from our sacred center, taking us away from knowing our own innate power, which is what, in my opinion, what the controllers really want us to stay away from is understanding actually how powerful we really are. And
that's right.
And drugs, alcohol, all these vices that we have at our disposal now definitely take our power away as well, because it takes you, it removes your sense of self. Obviously, it makes you more suggestible. It allows you to be more relaxed with things you shouldn't be relaxed with. And one of the things before we start really wrapping up here, that I wanted to bring to you and see if you are interested in, not interested in, if you've heard of the comedy scene that's going on in Austin, Texas right now. If you have
No.
know anything about, well, we are pretty big comedy fans, and we watch it from the aspect of like knowing that this is gets kind of like our distraction, I would call it.
Yeah.
But basically, going on right now in Austin, Texas, is a huge exodus of comedians who have been moving from LA or all different parts of the United States, typically New York, LA. There's this huge exodus into Austin, Texas that's been going on since C19, basically. And Joe Rogan was the first one to actually initiate this. So Joe Rogan moved his show and his studio from LA to Austin, and now it is just one other, all these comedians, it's all happening in Austin, Texas. And we've been talking about it in the sense of that it's a lot like what happened in the 60s in San Francisco and in Laurel Canyon. There's this huge hub going on. And to me, it speaks to a lot of the same themes that we're talking about today, just the degenerate nature of it, late night, lots of alcohol, lots of
Yeah.
drugs, lots of sex. Obviously everyone likes to laugh. Who doesn't want to laugh? It's wonderful. As I said, I'm a fan of comedy, but we're watching this with the lens of eyes to see, I guess you could say. And so I just wanted to kind of get your perspective on that and see if you've looked into that at all. But if you haven't, I suggest you do, because Alex Jones hands in this as well. There's all this stuff going on, and it's really interesting. We're seeing a lot of the same sort of Laurel Canyon programming in the comedian scene, and it's just something to be aware of, I suppose. There's a main comedy club that just opened by this guy named Red Band, and he's kind of like, he's been a producer. He was Joe Rogan's original producer, actually, and his comedy club is called the Sunset Strip Comedy Club. And so there's all this crossover of lingo too that's happening, and it's just really interesting to kind of see it going down.
It's the creation of Pied Pipers.
Yes.
This is what they do. So I know we're really short on time, but let me explain this real quick. So the whole mindset of cultural Marxism is also tied into the cult of Pan.
Yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look, and the Pied Piper is a play on Pan, right? The Pied Piper leads the children out, right? And then he's playing his flute. Look at the cover of the Sgt. Pepper album cover. The Beatles are in multicolored outfits. In fact, the entire album is multicolored, but look at their outfits. Pied means multicolored. The Beatles are the Pied Pipers, leading their followers with their music to the Eon of Horus, to the Age of Aquarius, to the end state that the controllers are looking to, their goal line, which I think they think they're going to have everything sewn up on January 1st of the 22nd century. I mean, this is just a thought in my mind that they've got this this thing planned out, and they've got control points like 2030 as an example, right? 2030 is just a stop along their timeline of pushing the agenda forward. They'll have an agenda 2040, 2050, 2060, 2070. But the Beatles are the Pied Pipers. And take a look at the instruments that the Beatles are holding on the cover of Sgt. Pepper. They are wind instruments.
Ah, yeah.
Pan,
Right.
the Pied Piper. So, and I mean, I could get into Pan too, but I know we're short on time. So that's a lot of what's going on behind the scenes that the Beatles are a part of. It's important to understand that the Beatles are are part of a much larger picture, although they play a very significant role in that agenda. They were very, very key to kicking off the counterculture back in the early 1960s, and the Frankfurt School in Tavistock, very, very successful, very successful. I could vouch for it because all I have to do is take a look at the comment section and how many people absolutely don't want to hear what I have to say about the Beatles because it's a religion. It's another ism. And, like I said, they create Pied Pipers and people follow.
Wow, indeed. Man, Mike, this was excellent. Thank you so much for imparting all this wisdom. This has been a really good conversation and just really grateful to have had some of your time.
You're very welcome, Michelle. Maybe we could do a part 2 at some point. And there's just so much to this thing. I'm doing a documentary with Jay, as I mentioned, and I told him there's so many touch points. I don't even know how we can get the documentary done.
Oh yeah, that'll be really exciting though. I definitely hope that all plays out and comes to fruition because that I think that a lot of people too. I do think as much as I see people wanting to avoid these truths and this and that and the other thing, I do think there's more people that are becoming more open to understanding that there is something weird going on. And I just don't think like everyone isn't meant to see this stuff. It's just like how it is, just like with everything in life. Some people are going to get it. Some people aren't ready for it. Some people,
Yeah.
their mind isn't even like close to being able to wrap themselves around it. So I just feel grateful for being one of the people that have been able to see the light, honestly, because it's been such a helpful thing in my life in so many ways. It's one of the reasons why I call my show The Healing Home, because learning this information, what we're talking about today, has been so freaking healing for me. And it is accelerated my ability to heal and to help others heal, because when you can see this stuff, things start to make so much more sense. As crazy as it can make you feel, you just see life through a different lens, and it's really helpful. So kudos. Thank you for doing all you do. It's valuable work and it's much needed, really. So
It's
I honor
probably going
you.
to kill me.
Oh man, I hope not, man.
No, I mean from exhaustion.
Oh, oh, I get it. Yeah. I mean, this kind of stuff is really, it's not for the faint of heart. That's for the truth. So please tell everyone where they can find you. I will also have all your links in the description of this video down below. But if you have any parting words or that you'd like to share with the audience, the floor is yours, sir. Thank you again, and I wish you the best.
Well, thank you, Michelle. To take a look at my work, my music, just go to my hub website. It's Sage of Quay, SAGEOFQUAY.com. All the links are there, all the platforms, Reverb Nation, SoundCloud, where my music is. Just head over there. And if you're interested in the Beatles, go to my Paul is Dead channel, my Beatles channel. The link is there, and you can start taking a look. I have 300 videos up, Michelle.
Wow, 300. I did see too that you had put a post up maybe last month about there's been 5 million views on that's crazy. I mean, that is such a huge milestone.
Over the 8 years, 5 million views or listens to all of the material. And how do I come up with that number? I just go to 2 of my channels. I go to my main channel, Sage of Quay, and I go to my Paul is Dead channel. And the Paul is Dead channel is very easy. You just go to your About You page, and it tells you how many views there have been. And then for my other channel, I've got to count them up. So it's just those 2 channels. It's more than 5 million, actually, because I don't count in Rumble, Odyssey, BitChute.
Oh, man.
I want to keep it conservative because because there's always somebody out there, that's going to say, it can't be 5 million. Well, it is 5 million. So, yeah, it's quite amazing. It really is.
Man, well, that's awesome. Glad to see it. Glad to hear it. And I would love to have you back for a part 2 at some point. So we can talk about that at some other time. But until next time, thank you everyone for being here with us, and enjoy the rest of your day, Mike.
You too, Michelle.
All right. See you soon.
So what brought you to this research? Let's do a little backstory on it.
Well, I was a big Beatle freak ever since I was a little kid. I've told this story a number of times, going back to 1968 when the Beatles came out with Yellow Submarine. I was well aware of the Beatles by that time. I was born in '59, so I was 9 years old when the movie came out, and I just bugged my parents to take me to the theater to see the film. And so finally my father relented, and he took my brother and I. My brother's just about 15 months younger than I am. He was another little Beatle freak. So the Beatles were the reason why I learned to play guitar. They taught me, by listening to their music, how to write music, to record music. So they were a huge influence in my life. I collected a lot of Beatle memorabilia over time. In fact, I have, well, it's smaller now because I sold off about half of it, but I had a huge vinyl collection of Beatle albums from all over the world. I collected for many, many years. And I guess about a month ago, I ran into another collector, and I told him what I had, and I was able to offload a good chunk of it. I kept the really valuable stuff. I still have that. He was interested in many of the records I had, a lot of the reissues, and some of the memorabilia, so he took that off my hands. The point I'm making is I was really, really, really into the Beatles. To this day, I still enjoy the music, and that led me into high school, which was around 1976. Yeah, 76. I was into the whole Paul is dead conspiracy, and I didn't believe that Paul was dead. I thought it was just an elaborate marketing ploy to sell more records, and the Beatles have always been sold to us as very clever, witty guys. I just thought it was a clever, witty thing that they were doing. But I loved taking a look at the clues on the albums and playing the songs backwards because the songs were backmasked and stuff like that. So my high school was very progressive back in the day, and they were open to having students bring in outside speakers. So I had a friend, Adam, and Adam had an older brother, Doug. Doug was about 5 years older than we were. And he had all the Beatle albums, and he knew all the Beatle clues from the Paul is Dead conspiracy. And so I asked Doug if he would come to the school and do a presentation, and he said, yeah, he would do it. So he did. And the day that we had the presentation, it was standing room only. And that was really when I really got into the Paul is Dead conspiracy. And like I said, I didn't believe that Paul was actually dead. I thought it was just a marketing gimmick. But then what happened was I was chugging along, still loving the Beatles. And then in 2016, I bought the book, The Memoirs of Billy Shears. And I bought it on a lark. I was on Amazon, and Amazon came up with recommendations and said, hey, we think you might like this book based upon other stuff that you've looked at and bought, which was Beatles stuff. And so I bought the book in 2016, and I started reading it. And when I started reading it, I couldn't believe what I was reading, because the story that's told in the Memoirs of Billy Shears is very, very different. So it presented a completely different backstory and narrative around the Beatles. That led me to taking a look at the book, breaking it down, decoding it, and figuring out whether the book was truthful or not. And to make a long story short, I've been at this now for 8 years, 2016 to 2024, and based upon my work, I concluded that the book is truthful. There are threads of fiction in the book. It's classified as historical fiction, and the reason for that is for reasons of plausible deniability, because the person behind the book, Billy Shears, the guy who's playing the part of Paul McCartney, and has been since late 1966, I believe it was September 11th of 66, that's what we're told in the book. So for almost 60 years, He's the person playing the part, and the book is written in the first person, so it's Billy speaking to us. It's Billy telling the story. The one thing, actually a big thing, that caught my attention with memoirs is the amount of detail in the book. There was so much detail that I thought to myself, this can only come from somebody that is either in the inner circle or is the person that's playing the role of Paul McCartney. And the book is authored by Thomas E.U. Harriot, but Tom is really the encoder. And the reason why he's referred to as the encoder is because the book is encoded, and you have to decode it in order to break the book down and get to the truth behind the Beatles story. So that's where we are today, and I've been at it for, like I said, for 8 years, getting into various aspects of the Beatles' unofficial story. And probably what I'll be known for, out of all the work that I've done, is questioning whether the Beatles wrote all their own music and played on all of their recorded tracks. So I think that has us up to date, Julia.
Well, great. Who has the hand up the puppet that we call the Beatles?
That could be a very lengthy answer. So we have to go back to organizations like the Frankfurt School out of Frankfurt, Germany. The Beatles were a creation of Tavistock. Now, this is told to us in memoirs, but it's also told to us in a book that came out in the early 1990s by Dr. John Coleman, titled The Committee of 300. So the book that Coleman wrote is not about the Beatles. It's about the control system that's in place and who's behind the curtain. And so Coleman spends a lot of time talking about the Committee of 300 and Tavistock. Tavistock reports into the committee. If you go back to the Frankfurt School, we're talking about cultural Marxism. The overall system from a secret society perspective comes under the umbrella of Freemasonry. But underneath Freemasonry, there are many other secret societies. It's a federation of secret societies. So you've got the Masons, you've got the Jesuits, you have the Rosicrucians, you have the Pilgrim Society, you have the Templars. And if you read another book that John Coleman wrote on Tavistock, and his book on Freemasonry is a very good book on Freemasonry, what you'll start to understand is the Masons are all about a completely different societal and cultural construct. Their concept, their idea of what this world is going to look like, and I say the world, not just the United States, is going to be, and we can already see it today, is very different than what it was when I was a kid. The amount of change that they're looking to implement is going to be even more drastic if they have their way as we march forward. So within Freemasonry, it's a pagan-based spiritual belief system. It goes back to the Egyptian mysteries. It goes back to Babylon, to the Babylonian priesthood. So what this means is that they are looking to implement, like I mentioned, a different system. And that different system means that they have to unravel and dismantle the current system. So what was the current system when this really got kicked off? Let's pick a date or a year, 1960. It was going on before that, but we'll look at 1960 because that's when the counterculture really got kicked into high gear. They're looking to dismantle the traditional values, the traditional family structure, traditional institutionalized religion, and in particular, Christianity. So if you read John Coleman's book on Freemasonry, what he tells you is that the Freemasons absolutely despise Christianity. Even though they will deny it, they despise it. So it's got to be removed. And the reason why it's got to be removed is not because they just despise it. It's because it's in the way of where they're going. Their God is Lucifer. And John Coleman explains, I think it's by the 26th degree in Freemasonry, and we're talking about the 33 degrees of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry. At the 26th degree, for those who make it to that degree, that is when it's revealed to them that their God is Lucifer. Before that, from the first degree through the 25th, all that matters is that the Mason has a belief in a God, a higher power, a creator, a source. Doesn't matter. It could be the Christian God, it could be Allah, and so on. So they're brought along very incrementally and very methodically. And of course, there's a lot of fallout. A lot of the Freemasons really never get past the 4th degree. So we talk about the Blue Lodges all the time. The Blue Lodges are the first 3 degrees. So what the system looks to do is to identify those Masons who are intrepid, those that they believe will push their agenda forward. And they're bound by their oaths. And they refer to their oaths as obligations. And they take their oaths and their obligations very, very seriously. And if a Mason breaches those oaths, the repercussions, the consequences can be severe. Now, what does severe mean? Well, it could mean that they are completely excommunicated. And if you ever had an opportunity to read some of their oaths, it could be something a lot worse, like death. And we have to understand that these secret societies, they trump the laws of the land or of your country. So their oaths and their obligations are, like I said, are very, very serious. It's serious business for them. So the ideology that encompasses what the world order, the New World Order, is trying to do has to do with Marxism. So if we go back to, as I mentioned before, the Frankfurt School, the primary members were Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, Erich Fromm, and Herbert Marcuse. And cultural Marxism looks to dismantle the system of society and culture that we have today. If you go back to Karl Marx, think of him as a theoretician, and then we had Lenin, and the approach back in the day was to put Marxism or communism in place using force. That didn't work out too well. They tried that going back to the Russian Revolution, where the Bolsheviks came in. That was successful, but it was brutal. It was brutally done. When that happened, the Bolsheviks, the communists, were hoping that what would happen is that the workers throughout the world were going to rise up, and that was what was going to implement Marxism across the world, worldwide Marxism or communism, and that didn't happen. So enter groups like the Frankfurt School, which was a think tank out of the University of Frankfurt, Germany, and their approach was, hey, this method of using force and violence is not going to work. The way you're going to be able to implement worldwide Marxism is you have to subvert from within. So in order to dismantle the existing structures of society and culture, you have to penetrate them from within and then begin to dismantle it. They knew that it would take a long time to do this. They knew it would be a very methodical and incremental process. In fact, another organization that is closely tied to the Frankfurt School and part of the whole New World Order, one world government structure is the Fabian Society. And the Fabian Society, their logo displays a wolf in sheep's clothing. And the Fabian Society is very, very upfront about how they go about their business, which is incrementally and methodically. So if we go back to, as an example, go back to the Frankfurt School, because they're the ones that I believe play most significantly into the Beatles. So one of their leaders is a guy named Max Horkheimer, who I named before. And here's a quote from Max Horkheimer. The revolution won't happen with guns. So he's talking about the revolution of bringing in cultural Marxism, to bring in communism worldwide. It won't happen with guns. Rather, it will happen incrementally, year by year, generation by generation. We will gradually infiltrate their educational institutions and their political offices, transforming them slowly into Marxist entities as we move towards universal egalitarianism. So they talk a lot about egalitarianism. They come across sounding very altruistic, but I believe that's gaslighting. One of their approaches is to tell people, the masses, what they want to hear. In other words, they'll just lie to them to placate them. And while the lie is in place and they're placating the population, they go about their business in a subversive way to start making the changes that they feel they need to make. So if we take a look at some of the high-level approaches that the Frankfurt School has put in play, their strategy, they very much wanted to create racial divides, to create change by creating confusion. So think about this as I go through these. There's about 11 of them. let the audience think in terms of today. What's going on today? Do we have racial divides? We certainly do. Is there a lot of confusion? Yes, there is. And it's the teaching of sex, sexual behaviors to children to undermine the school and the teacher's authority. Huge immigration to destroy identity. By bringing in all the immigration, by breaking down the borders, what they're doing is to eliminate nationality. And it's also a way, I'm talking in terms of how they approach this. It's a way to homogenize society. It's a way to erase the traditional values or the ancestral values that a particular person or family would have based upon their family's ancestry, their lineage. So as an example, Italians have a certain culture. The Irish have a certain culture. The French have a certain culture. The Mexicans have a certain culture. Well, they don't want that. They don't want individual culture. What they want to do is they want to homogenize it and have everybody believe and operate within a culture, one culture. And that's called pop culture. So the pop culture that we have was something that was put in play by the Frankfurt School and Tavistock. It's a creation. Pop culture is manufactured. It's not organic. It's not natural. It's completely manufactured. Another method of dismantling the culture in a society is to promote excessive drinking, to empty the churches. I talked about they have a big bullseye on Christianity, to create an unreliable legal system with a bias against the victims of crime, and we see that more and more these days, creating a dependency on the state or state benefits, dumbing down and controlling the population through mass media, and encouraging the breakdown of the family. They needed to erase the family nucleus. And one of their methods to break down the family nucleus was to attack the male. It's to attack the masculine end of the equation. So they went off and said that the current system is patriarchal, and a patriarchal system is bad. We need more feminine energy. It needs to be more women-based, because that will bring a softer approach to society. Now, a lot of people are listening to this, and they're probably thinking, well, I think that might be true. But the reason why they did it was so that they can get rid of the masculine input into society, into the family, where the male role was more oriented toward security and defending the family. To them, that was a barrier. They didn't want strong males because they knew if they had a strong male population with strong family values, that they couldn't push their Marxism over the goal line. Another aspect of that would be the women's movement. The methods coming out of the Frankfurt School and Tavistock were telling women, especially in Western society and the United States, that why do you want to stay home and be with your children? Why do you want to raise kids? Why do you want to do that? That's really something that has been imposed upon you through societal norms. It's not really something you want to do. You're doing it only because you're told this is the way it is. That's a form of gaslighting. Because quite honestly, a lot of women were perfectly happy with their traditional role of raising a family because raising children was very important. So they introduced this dialectic into the equation, and we have this whole shift where women left the household, they went into the workforce, the father was also working, and now the children, well, who's going to take care of them? So that's when we started getting daycare, preschool, after school. So the children, in a way, become wards of the state. So the children have less face time or interacting with their biological parents. These are the types of tactics that were being used. Now, just going through all this, I know it's a little long-winded, but one of the biggest tools in the toolbox of Tavistock is the music and entertainment industry. And they knew that they could have tremendous influence and tremendous leverage and could make tremendous change through the music and entertainment business. Now, we see this all the time with Hollywood. All the Hollywood movies that come out are programming the population one way or another. There are agendas which are inserted into the scripts, even very subtly, but they are there. Some are not subtle at all. But music was another big lever that they could play. So in fact, let me just pull something up here. I want to read something Another comment or another narrative that came out of the Frankfurt School was to use music to promote mental illness and destroy society. That verses set to music and repeatedly intoned or repeatedly played are very effective. And Adorno had said that music can promote a culture of pessimism and despair. And not just music, but they can do this through radio and television. So as I mentioned, when you look into the Frankfurt School on mainstream sources, it's going to come across as egalitarian. Oh, well, they're looking to try to do good things. They're trying to level the playing field. They want not equal opportunity, they want equal outcomes. For the longest time, we've heard, even on mainstream media, the cultural wars. What does that mean when we talk about the cultural wars? What cultures are at war? Well, it's the current culture, which in the minds of the Frankfurt School and Tavistock was predominantly Christian-based, especially in the United States, versus their culture. So they set off to attack the way of life that we were born and raised in so that they can take it down and pursue an agenda of communism. Now, if we go to the Beatles, in John Coleman's book, he brings up, now Coleman's book on the Committee of 300 is not about the Beatles, but he brings up the Beatles a number of times because they are tied into Tavistock, and he talks about the Frankfurt School, and he talks about Theodore Adorno, that Adorno was tied into the Beatles' music. So the Beatles were one of those levers, one of those big levers in the toolbox of the controllers to kick off the change in society and culture in the very beginning of the 1960s. This is why the 1960s was referred to as the counterculture. It was anti-establishment. So that was a big change they were looking to put in play. And the Beatles were the first manufactured band to come out with the sole mission or objective to social engineer on a grand scale. This is based upon my research. Okay, so I'll stop there if you have any questions. I don't want to just keep going here. Do you have a...
I hit mute because I am listening intently. And I have thoughts that I don't throw in because it's impossible to listen while you're talking. So you continue on. I don't know anything of what you're speaking because that part of your research I haven't run across yet.
Okay.
But I am now. So I guess in this moment, the continuing of the story is all on you.
Okay.
Please do.
So before we get to the Beatles, and I'll talk more about their role in changing society and culture, and you have to just excuse me because I'm doing all of this off the top of my head. I don't have very many notes in front of me right here. In the 1950s, actually I think it began in the 1940s, but it was more predominant in the 1950s, the Beat movement. Remember the Beat poets? And that would be Allen Ginsberg, William S. Burroughs, Jack Kerouac. Those are three names that those that know about the Beat movement would know about or relate to. Well, the Beat movement were cultural Marxists, and it's tied into the cult of pants. And what do I mean by that? It's an ideology and a philosophy that says there should be no constraints. You should be able to do whatever it is that you want to do. If you go back to the 1960s, there was the old tagline, if it feels good, do it. And that pretty much summarizes one of the main narratives with cultural Marxism, that society is holding you down. Society is oppressing you. You are shackled. You're not pursuing your life. You're not pursuing your true and pure will. And that also ties back to Aleister Crowley. So the Beat poets, if you look it up on Wikipedia and you look up the Beat movement, it'll tell you that one of their traits was they were hedonists, unconstrained, do not follow societal norms, because to do so is oppressive. If you go back to Aleister Crowley, Crowley talks about his new eon, the eon of Horus, which is where the controllers are attempting to take us. Now, Crowley said that his eon of Horus began in the early 1900s, but before the eon of Horus, there was the eon of Osiris. And Crowley explained that the eon of Osiris, which equates to roughly to the Piscean age, whereas the eon of Horus is the age of Aquarius, he explained that his eon of Osiris, the Piscean age, was oppressive. Man was shackled. They did not follow their true will. Well, what are the cultural Marxists saying? They're saying the exact same thing. And so they're trying to lead the population to a new age, a new age where they're saying it's just going to be great. It's going to be a utopia. There's going to be equality everywhere. There's not going to be any wars. There's not going to be any starvation. What they're not telling anybody is the reason why there's not going to be any wars or any starvation is because they're not going to create any wars and they're not going to starve people. So enter Tavistock. Tavistock is the New World Order or the World Order, however you want to refer to them, the controllers. It's their brainwashing, mind control, and social engineering apparatus. Think of it as social engineering HQ. The Beatles were introduced to the United States in 1964. Of course, they were playing over in England in 1962, where they were being handled and groomed to be what they became, going back into their Hamburg days. And I have surmised and speculated that perhaps it's even possible that the Beatles themselves, especially Paul McCartney and John Lennon, were in a mind control program. Why do I say that? Because there are images on the internet of John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and George Harrison with bird cages on their heads. Bird cage symbolism in Illuminati speak means mind control. So if we think about where music was before the Beatles entered the scene, and I'll use the United States as the talking point here, knowing that they were getting their legs back in Britain back in 1962. Think about what happened. They blast out onto the scene, completely different type of music, different hairstyles, clothing, even attitude. Think about, for the folks that are listening to this, think about when the Beatles were doing interviews. There was this very quippy, witty, almost sometimes snarky attitude towards the, quote, establishment press or whoever was asking the questions. This was all prescribed. This was all scripted to give the impression and the perception that the established system should not be listened to, that there was a new generation that was emerging. So there was a massive marketing push behind the Beatles that started going back to a guy by the name of William Mann, was a music critic for the Times of London. This goes back to, I think, 1963, where he was pumping the Beatles up as these brilliant composers. And this was done in order to get people thinking that way, to condition them and to brainwash them into accepting this new musical movement, this new genre of music that Tavistock was pushing on to the worldwide stage. And I should also mention, too, I was talking about the Frankfurt School. So when we talk about the Frankfurt School, we talk about the Fabian Society and Tavistock. These are all interwoven. They're all working together. And when I say they're all working together as part of the one world, one religion agenda that has been in place for a long time, that we really, really see being played out big time today for anybody that's paying attention to what's going on in the world, especially the World Economic Forum, organizations like that, Bilderbergs, Davos, the Trilateral Commission, the Council on Foreign Relations. All of these organizations are tied into the internationalist structure, the one world governance that's in play. That has been in play for a long time. So the Beatles were used to be that big lever in the music business and to change and shift the mindset, especially of the young people. They were not concerned about the older generation. In fact, Tavistock's approach was to create tension between the older generation, which would be the parents, and their children. That's exactly what they were looking for. They wanted the newer generation, they wanted the kids to see their parents as old-fashioned, as not with it. You used to hear the term, they're squares. So they were social engineering the young people. So what did this lead to? Well, this eventually led to activity that contradicted traditional values. This led to activity which was a break from the family nucleus. It was a break from what was considered to be acceptable values or acceptable behavior from a community or society. So what do I mean by that? The introduction of drugs, free sex, it was the entire hippie movement. All of this stuff was brought about by Tavistock, and the Beatles played a big part in it. So by the time the Beatles got to Sgt. Pepper was the stake in the ground which kicked off the psychedelic era. And the psychedelic era was very important to Tavistock and the controller's cultural Marxist agenda, because now we had people experimenting with drugs, looking to experiences outside of their physical senses. In other words, they were able to like drop acid. There are a lot of people I know that are thinking, well, this doesn't sound bad. And the reason why it doesn't sound bad is because we have been indoctrinated with this process, this social engineering coming out of the Frankfurt School and Tavistock with music and tying it back to the Beatles for 60 years. So it's the boiling frog phenomenon. It's so incremental, it's so methodical that you really forget what the baseline was. But if you go back in time, if you think about the societal structure in the 1950s in the United States, fast forward to 1969 and Woodstock. So let's just take a look at a 10 to 15 year period of time. Let's just say from 1955 to 1969. A huge change in how the young people were thinking and how they were operating and how they were behaving. It was massive. Now let's move from 1969 to current day 2024. And let's take a look at the music industry. And what do we see? We see an industry that is loaded up with satanic symbolism. It's huge. There's a huge, huge difference. And we can see, if we're honest with ourselves, if we're intellectually honest, we can see the degradation in society. We can see the degradation in the culture. We can see the degradation in people's thinking. There's so much less critical thinking. And that's because part of this whole process was to create a hive mind. I talked about before about homogenizing things. This is exactly what they want. Cultural Marxism wants to eliminate the individual, the focus on the individual, your individuality. They want that out of the way. What they want is consensus via a community. And the reason why individualism doesn't work is because an individual will critically think, and an individual will ask questions. So a community that is established on strong individualism, where people are resourceful, they're smart, they're resilient, well, that community is going to be very strong. But if we strip the individual out of the equation, and this is what they have done, that's why they keep talking about we're all in this together. We hear this all the time. Whenever there's some kind of staged event, we're all in this together. They want to dilute the thinking of the population down to a communal level with no strong individuals. This way, they are easily controlled. And the music industry has been paramount in pushing that kind of mindset. Also, they knew that the music industry in Hollywood would create Pied Pipers. Humans have an uncanny knack to follow. They decide who a leader is going to be. Now, a leader could be somebody that they worship, somebody they idolize. It doesn't have to be some kind of warrior. As an example, a band. A band would be a leader. They'll follow that band. And that band will take them down a particular path. The songs will have certain messages in them. And as I mentioned before, from the Frankfurt School, they said verses set to music and repeatedly intoned are very effective. So the point I'm trying to make is it's a massive mind control program. It's massive conditioning, social engineering on a gigantic scale. And the Beatles played a huge part in that. And I've spent a lot of time with my research trying to show this, putting forth evidence that they played a big role in this. Now, it's up to each individual, Julia, to accept it or not or believe it if it doesn't resonate with people. And for a lot of people, it doesn't resonate because, like I said, the indoctrination has been in place for so long, especially with regard to the Fab Four, 60 years. People will reject it out of hand. Nope, Beatle music is great, and they couldn't possibly have been part of something like this. Well, Beatles music is great. I loved it, but it was music with an agenda. And for those who question the whole Pied Piper bit, I think I mentioned before that cultural Marxism adopts, and Crowley as well, the cult of Pan. And I'll read you something here from the cult of Pan. Pan is the goat foot god of panic. That's where we get the word panic from, and pandemic. And it has to do with the sudden fear that seizes one alone in the forest. He is the god of vegetation, vegetarians. His name has been translated as, quote, all, for he stands for the manifestation of nature, paganism. He is raw, undirected energy, the dance of blood along the arteries, and rising sap. He is sexual desire running amok, a god of unfettered bodily instinct. No social force contains him. He is the lord of death, of corruption, bodily decay, and dissolution. He is also the mindless mob instinct, the beast who takes control of man, the frenzy of the flesh-ripping orgy. Wine, women, and song quicken his pleasure. He plays his pipe, and the forest resounds with laughter and celebration. In the esoteric tradition of the West, he often borrows the attributes of Dionysus, lord of the vine, who presides over intoxication and its after effects. So, if we take a step back, we could see that what we see going on in society and culture today is exactly that. Cultural Marxists are pushing an agenda where no social force contains anything. There are no rules. Do as thou wilt. If it feels good, do it. Even the Nike logo, the tagline, just do it. It goes back to Crowley. It goes back to the cult of Pan. And this is all tied into this cultural Marxism and this push to put forth a worldwide communist state. So I know I said a lot there, so I'll just pause there for a moment and I'll go wherever you want me to go. But I thought it was important to get that baseline in play.
I appreciate where we're at. I do have a input, which was the 1939 Institution of the Western Standard Tuning, where A is 440, as created and implemented by the Rockefeller Foundation, straight out of military intelligence design, because 440 disrupts you on a cellular level, whereas 528 is what supposedly the Beatles recorded. Now that would bring about a whole refreshing new, just by frequency, anything that you pick up from that frequency, that is the frequency of love.
Yes, well, they did change 440, and 440 is disruptive. In fact, there are papers that are written, believe it or not, on mainstream medical sites that say one of the other frequencies that they say is beneficial is 432.
There's a whole solfeggio scale that goes from each chakra down from your red zone up above your head to the crown chakra. So I'm going to introduce to my audience the principles of science, frequency, and our limitations in a human body. And that's part of my message that doesn't really apply to this conversation unless you bring out some information.
Music the frequency was corrupted. This speaks to the level of control that they have achieved. And I talk about they, I'm talking about the controllers. They control your media. They control your music and entertainment industry. They control your politics. They control your government. They control your medicine. They control every major aspect of life that we interact with. They created the entire corporatocracy, the corporate system, corporate matrix. That's theirs.
To name names, I'm going to bring up the Rockefellers, also known as the Rothschilds, previously Orsini's, who claim to go all the way back to Egyptian Nimrod.
They trace their ancestry and their lineage back to Egypt, and some researchers will say that before Egypt, it was called the land of Chem, and before that it was Sumeria. It's a very, very complicated topic, as you probably well know, Julia. There's a lot of different interpretations and debates about where it all connects.
Just to have a moment here, can you define the difference between Satanism, which is the prince of darkness, Satan, versus Luciferianism, which is Lucifer, the bringer of light? Whereas they are not the same, do they represent a dichotomy of opposites that must exist on our plane of existence due to the sine wave going up and down? Just our frequency automatically defines a singular into a dual, yes and no.
There is a difference between Luciferianism and Satanism. In fact, Luciferians will be very adamant about that. Are there similarities? Yes. Both look to manifest as much as they possibly can in the physical world. They come at life from the perspective that being born in itself into the world doesn't have any meaning. In other words, you have to do things. You've got to create. You have to manifest what your life is going to be all about. Luciferians, they will claim that they balance their physical world manifestations and desires with their responsibilities to the spiritual world. In other words, their worship of Lucifer. That means that, at least in their minds, and based upon what I've looked at, they look to balance karma. So for everything that they do, which is considered not good or evil or bad, they got to make up for it on the other end. There's got to be something done that's good, that's beneficial, something that's helpful. Whereas with Satanists, a Luciferian might argue that they don't balance that scale. In fact, they don't have a scale. They don't pay very much attention, if any at all, to whatever spiritual aspect that they may have. Everything is about physical world manifestations. It's about attaining as much as you possibly can. It's perfectly fine to take advantage of anybody that you need to take advantage of in order to pursue and achieve your goals. It's not their problem that somebody is not smart enough to realize when they're being duped or when they're being taken advantage of. They'll say it's not our problem. Not my problem, you're not smart. That's your problem. So if I'm able to get something out of you because you don't know any better, that's just the way it goes.
Okay, well, that brings me to the concept I'm currently looking into, is Paulism, or Christianity called Pauline Christianity. What do you think that means? To me, I don't know.
What the Luciferians do, they like to poke at Christianity. I mentioned before, if you go to John Coleman's book on Freemasonry, I think it's titled Freemasonry A to Z, Coleman's very clear that they really dislike Christianity. So a lot of times what they'll do is they will usurp Christian terms, Christian prayers, and they will twist it and use it for their belief system. So when we talk about Pauline Christianity, we're talking about the Apostle Paul. I don't believe that it's a coincidence that in the memoirs of Billy Shears, they talk about this religion called Paulism. Paulism, as it is described in the book, in the memoirs of Billy Shears, is a Luciferian-based spiritual system, a religion. It's a worship of the Beatles, and in particular, a worship of Paul McCartney. And is it a coincidence that they mapped it to Paulism and the Apostle Paul from Christianity? Let's just put it this way. I think it's very, very possible. If we go to John Lennon's song, I Found Out, Julia, he has a lyric in there that says, I've seen religions from Jesus to Paul.
I've never heard that song.
And in an interview that he did years ago, he said by the year 2000, Paul will be Jesus. What the controllers did as part of their culture war is to create a new religious belief system. And as weird as this is going to sound, because it does sound weird, trust me, I know, because when I was looking into it at first, I thought this is very, very strange and very odd. They created a religion around the Beatles, and that's Paulism. And people would say, well, what are you talking about? How are the Beatles a religion? A religion doesn't necessarily have to have all of its books and all that stuff. A religion is a mindset, it's a belief system, and there are followers. How many followers do the Beatles have? Millions? Now, of course, there are degrees of followers. Some are fanatical, others are not. And some people don't like the Beatles at all. But let's just talk about those that are connected into the Beatles. That following is huge. So they started off basic with their first album, Please Please Me, because Tavistock was not going to hit everybody over the head in 1963 with Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. There's a process of acclimation. There's a process of getting people conditioned to incrementally accept the changes and the differences and the messages that are in the music. And the Beatles brought an entirely different mindset to the population at the time, especially to the millions and millions of fans that were following them. I mentioned earlier there was a change in attire. There was a change in how people presented themselves with their longer hair and their beards. Think about how many people formed bands because of the Beatles. And you might say, well, is that a bad thing? I formed a band because of the Beatles. But Tavistock creates the genres of music. And those genres of music have an agenda. They have a purpose. So when you had the British invasion, that led to classic rock. And then you had all these other genres of music that followed. They were all connected back to the Beatles. The Beatles are foundational. there is a different target audience that Tavistock is going after. They're shaping, they're conditioning, they're massaging it, and they're getting the table set for the next turn of the crank, the next genre of music. So think about like punk music. Think about the word punk, a low life, punk music, low life music. It's wordplay. Think about David Bowie. David Bowie was the beginning of the androgyny mindset. And then we had the glam bands like Poison and Motley Crue. The guys in the band were all dressed up in makeup and long hair. And think about the term grunge, the grunge bands. What does grunge mean? Grunge is what? Grunge is dirty. And then you had the whole hip-hop movement, which led to rap, techno music. There were some researchers that believed the whole techno electronic music is frequency-based, that it is actually conditioning people based upon the frequency of that music. I listened to an interview of Alan Watt going back years ago. Alan's dead now, but Alan used to be in the music business, and he was doing a lot of discussions on where the world is at and how it's being social engineered and and all that stuff. But he mentioned that, and I don't know how he knows this, but he said that George Martin was an expert in sound and acoustics and how the sound frequencies affect the listener. So what's implied in there is that understanding of how frequencies affect us, how it affects the psychology of human beings, the mind, was in play going back to the 1960s with the Beatles music and in all likelihood other music as well. This is something that they know about. This is technology that they know about. And it's progressed to the point now where we have this electronic music, the pounding beats, putting people into a semi-trance state. In fact, there were Taylor Swift concerts where people who attended the concert said that they have vague memories of attending the concert and the songs because they tranced out. We have to ask ourselves, well, how is that happening? Well, it's the frequency of the music. It's also the presentation with strobe lighting and stuff like that. So anyway, I'm going off on a tangent here, I'm sure.
Oh no, because right now the rave music scene is the popular, in my case, local scene. And so for me to have an ear of maybe someone who produces this music, I will shout out to Unified Mountain Sounds as a unsolicited sponsorship, but I would like these men to understand this process because they have an audience, a growing audience, and a really good show on time. I enjoy it.
For the average person, for most people who are unaware of this, it's just music. I'm just going to have a good time, going to have a couple of drinks, going to dance, going to socialize, But, what they don't realize is that the environment today, the structures, the societal structures have been shaped. So you're operating, remember earlier in the discussion I said that the culture we were given, fed to us, is pop culture. So all of this continues to be part of the pop culture indoctrination. And people are going along for the ride, just going with the flow. Very few people are questioning anything. Like I know I'm talking about this stuff, Julia, and there are going to be people who are listening that are going to think that I'm just a stick in the mud. I just don't like where things are, and I like the old traditional values and all of this stuff, which, by the way, there's a lot to be said about traditional values and a family nucleus. So I'm not going to fall prey to people that want to say that that's old-fashioned, because the new fashion is something that's turning this world upside down, except most people don't understand that and don't realize it. They think that the world just evolves organically. It's just the natural ebb and flow of how things go. And I'm going to say that that's completely false. The way the world moves is scripted. It's manufactured. It's engineered by the controllers. They're behind all this. Think about fads, folks. Think about, we'll just go back to the 1960s and let's talk about bell bottoms. All of a sudden, bell bottoms appear. All of a sudden, in the 1970s, remember platform shoes? I don't know how old you are, Julia, but I'm 65 and I remember this.
I remember Tina Turner playing the Acid Queen in those tight red shoes. First run at the theater.
Just think about how things just appear in the stores. How does that happen? Is that organic? Last week we had this set of clothing, and then this week, boom, a completely new set of clothing on the clothing racks in the stores. Different types of shoes, different types of hairstyles. All of a sudden, I remember in the late 1970s, I was in high school, polyester suits and jackets were in. All of a sudden, polyester just shows up. That's a way to try to understand how it is that these things are engineered. So they're pushing this stuff out there. When I say they, talking about the control system, to grab you, to get you, to bring you into their agenda and the mindset that they want you to operate in.
Who is the top of the controllers, to name names that we would recognize maybe in our society? And if you don't feel like mentioning names for safety reasons, you can just bypass the algorithm and kind of describe who I'm talking about.
The people that we are familiar with, like the Rockefellers, called the liberal Eastern establishment, many of these operators, these guys, belong to a secret society called the Pilgrim Society. It's a society, it's a secret society that many people don't know about. And it is closely connected into the British elite system. So you have the American Eastern establishment elites, and you have the British elites, and you have this secret society called the Pilgrim Society. But there are many other secret societies. Like I said, there's a federation of them, and they come under the umbrella of Freemasonry. Right? So the typical names you know, like the Rothschilds you mentioned before, these are real movers and shakers from an internationalist perspective.
Is that like Washington, D.C., Fleet Street, and the Vatican?
Yes, exactly. You have three sovereign city-states. You have the inner city of London, which is HQ because they control all of the money. There's three huge financial institutions that are behind just about every single corporation in the world. I'm talking about the multinational corporations. You have BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. In fact, there was an analysis that was done about 10 years ago where somebody actually mapped the connection points between all of the major internationalist corporations, and there were connection points from a financial perspective. And financial is the most important because that's the money. Nothing's going to get done in this world without money. So you have BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. That stuff emanates out of the inner city of London. Then you have the Vatican. Now think of the Vatican as responsible for the spiritual part of the control system. And we could see now where the Pope is, he's massaging the Catholics and Christianity with opening up to other religions, to coexisting. Now, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with coexisting. It's great. But what I'm saying is what he's doing is not because he's kind, and it's not because he cares about coexistence. He's doing it because it's part of an agenda that they're implementing to get this egalitarian, homogenized communist culture to solidify it, to nail it down. So then we have Washington, D.C. So Washington, D.C. is also a sovereign city-state. Now, when I say sovereign city-state, folks, what I mean is they are sovereign. Washington, D.C. is not part of the Republic of the United States. The Vatican is not part of Italy. The inner city of London is not part of Britain. They are standalone. Think of them as sovereign countries within a country. And in the United States, Washington, D.C., the District of Columbia, is a sovereign city-state, and they are the military and police arm of this internationalist conspiracy. This is why Washington, D.C. will never be a state. Washington, D.C. won't be a state because Washington, D.C. is sovereign. And to take it a step further, this means that the United States is under foreign occupation because our president, the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch, the Supreme Court, all reside in the sovereign city-state of the District of Columbia, not the Republic of the United States. And the District of Columbia was formed back with the Act of 1871, where land was etched out from Virginia and Maryland to create D.C. And it was created on the behalf of the internationalist bankers. So we talked about the inner city of London, the Rothschilds. So this is a hard pill for a lot of people to swallow because they want to think that there's still a constitution in place. They want to believe that this is still a republic. It's not.
It's a corporation, and today is the anniversary of the Magna Carta. Just to throw that factoid I ran into a few hours ago.
Is today the anniversary of the Magna Carta?
Yes, and I was mentioning online that the people that said that the presidents were all related were half right But a 12-year-old girl researched the female lines, and at that time found 43 out of 44 of the presidents, all related to King John Lackland, who didn't have any land, but he signed an agreement with the Vatican, and the royalty became the landlords, and we are now the vassals.
Yeah, and the thing is, this also goes back to an entity, a secret society, which is very, very secret, called the Black Nobility. The Black Nobility are these families that go back to Rome. They believe and they operate under the guise that they own us. They own the world. They are de facto rulers of the world. So it's really funny because I'm just going through some research on them to read something I have here. The most powerful of the Black Nobility families are located in Italy, Germany, Switzerland, Britain, Holland, and Greece, in that order. Their roots may be traced back to the Venetian oligarchs who are of Khazar extraction, the Khazarians, some folks might relate to that, and married into these royal houses in the early part of the 12th century, and so on and so on. According to researcher and author Dr. John Coleman, who I spoke a lot about during this our discussion here, a committee of 300 was established early in the 18th century. So John Coleman's book on the Committee of 300 is highly recommended. It's a fantastic book. But the Committee of 300 did not take on its present form until around 1897. So a lot of stuff took place in the late 1800s with regard to a lot of what's going on today. It was the segue, the lead into World War I, then it led into World War II, and so on. But here's something that's interesting, Julia, that I'll read to you. Documentary proof as to the existence of the Committee of 300 is not forthcoming, and it may be no more than a convenient phrase to describe certain key players. Socialist politician and financial advisor to the Rothschilds, Walter Rathenau, writing in the Weimar Press on December 24th of 1921, so Christmas Eve of 1921, said, now this is the financial advisor to the Rothschilds. This is what he said. Only 300 men, each of whom knows all others, govern the fate of Europe. They selected their successors from their own entourage. These men have the means in their hands of putting an end to the form of state which they find unreasonable. Exactly 6 months after that statement was published, Rathenau was assassinated. So there you go. So that would tell me that the Committee of 300 is real, and some of the Black nobility actually sit on the Committee of 300.
I have a question about the O negative tie between a lot of our icons, such as John Lennon, Hitler, Manson, and so on. What is that like alien missing link? Because the Rh negative factor is what qualifies it as a positive or a negative, and missing means that there's something added to our DNA that creates a new bloodline. Do you have anything to say about that?
No, I don't. I mean, I've heard this, and I really don't know. I haven't looked too deep into it, but I will say this. Bloodlines are very, very important to the ruling elites. And I just said, going back to the Black nobility and all of these other secret societies. Very, very important. So maybe the O negative, Julia, is maybe it's an attribute of a bloodline that is considered to be special. I don't know.
Well, I am studying that, and it's very important because even Vlad the Impaler, Dracula, is part of that group.
Well, didn't King Charles say he was related to Vlad the Impaler? I think he did.
The royalty of the family there is actually the published owner of the copywritten version King James Bible, published in their name, which makes it a real contrived, copyrighted book. It's a good book.
Yeah. So it's it's a crazy, crazy world. It is. I know we didn't talk too much about the Beatles.
Well, I do. I just actually thought, how is Billy Shears? Where was he born? Who is he? Do you know who his parents are? Or does he become a creation of the military intelligence that I think is behind it? Who's his daddy?
Yeah, who's his daddy? That's a good question. Well, there was a researcher, a colleague of mine, that did a presentation, and it was very compelling, and I think that she probably did figure out his family tree. The way she did it is the clues are in memoirs. I mentioned memoirs is an encoded book. So if you are very intrepid and you start taking a look at how things are worded and how things are encoded, you can possibly break the code. And if you break the code, then obviously you get to the truth. So Stacy, she traces his family tree back to two bloodlines. And these are blue bloodlines. The Douglas Hamiltons and the Percys. So the Douglas Hamiltons would be on his father's side of the house, and the Percys would be on his mother's side of the house. Now, what's interesting is in the book, he mentions that he has Campbell relatives, and the Campbell bloodline comes up through his mother's side of the family, the Percys. So the Douglas Hamiltons and the Percys are two powerful bloodlines, and they're Scottish. If I had to guess, based upon Stacy's work, I think she probably is flying over the target. His father would have been Douglas Hamilton, Lord Douglas Hamilton. Now think of the line in the song A Day in the Life. Nobody was really sure if he was from the House of Lords. So that's another clue, I think.
It means more now than it did before I had this in my head.
Exactly. So before it was like, okay, well, it was just a lyric. And now, based upon Stacy's work, it makes you wonder, okay, is it just a lyric or was it a clue that was dropped? And almost 60 years later, somebody figured it out. Whether his family is the Douglas Hamiltons and the Percys, whether that's his mother and father, I don't know. I can't say for sure. But her work is very compelling. One way or another, Billy's lineage, his ancestry, has got to be from elite bloodlines, Julia.
Well, sure. Do you have a date of birth or any idea of the legitimacy that they can conceal? Of course, they can give birth to a non-recorded human.
Yeah, people always ask me about, well, what about birth certificates? What about death certificates and all this stuff?
They're fake anyway.
Yeah, I mean, you're dealing with a very, very involved deep state operation. The Beatles are a deep state operation. They are a deep state psychological operation created by Tavistock with influences coming in from the Frankfurt School, the whole cultural Marxism thing that I was talking about earlier. But they can do whatever they want, Julia. They can make birth certificates. They can delete them. They can create death certificates. They can get rid of them.
Yeah.
They can do whatever they want. Now, Billy, he does tell us in Magical Mystery Tour, he alludes to the fact that he's 5 years older than he actually is. So that would mean that he was born in 1937. So the way you get there is he's supposed to be Paul McCartney. Paul McCartney was born in 1942. If he's 5 years older, as he states in Magical Mystery Tour, that means that he was born in 1937. Now, another researcher that I know, excellent researcher, Sally Whitty, believes that his birthday is September 11th of 1937.
That would make sense.
Yeah, she's very, very keen on that's in all likelihood his birthday. Originally, I thought it might have been September 9th of 1937 because he loves September 9th. He loves the double nines. You know, if I'm right, it's September 9th. If Sally's right, it's September 11th. Or we could both be wrong, and it could be a different date. But for sure, he was born in 1937.
Is his biological dad possibly Aleister Crowley? Because James McCartney looks just like Aleister Crowley. And Vivian Stanshall, if you'll cover that, I think we'll have a little bit more of a flow picture here.
So let's talk about Crowley. There is an image where it takes half of Crowley's face and half of James McCartney. Now, James McCartney, for those that don't know, would be Paul McCartney or Billy's son. There's a picture where they take half of Crowley's face and half of James's face, and I mean, I have to admit, it looks a lot like Aleister Crowley. Is that proof of anything? No, it's not proof of anything. I mentioned Stacy's work where she takes Billy back to the Douglas Hamiltons and the Percys, and I think that that's probably more likely. Memoirs, it alludes a lot to the possibility that Crowley was his biological father. And how could that be? Well, Crowley was involved in a lot of sex magic. And so Billy could have been the result of a sex magic ritual. And by the way, in the occult, if a child is conceived from a sex magic ritual, they are considered special. And so they are earmarked for bigger and better things in life. This is something that's also explained in the book. But I'm not so sure that, honestly, that Crowley is his biological father. Do I think that Crowley was influential in Billy's upbringing? In other words, being taught the occult, being taught the ways of mysticism and the esoteric, in the ways of Thelema, that's Aleister Crowley's religion. Yeah, I think that that's very possible. In the book, he does say that he was mentored by Aleister Crowley for 10 years. So if Billy was born in 1937 and Crowley, we know, died in 1947, that's the 10-year period of time. In the book, he also mentions, Julia, that he was subjected to ritual abuse and mind control from an early age. And he goes back to the age of 3. So then we have Sgt. Pepper, released in 1967, and it says it was 20 years ago today that Sgt. Pepper taught the band to play. For whatever reason, many people believe Sgt. Pepper is a reference to Aleister Crowley. There is one piece of, maybe, I don't want to, it's not evidence, but it's speculative. In Rosemary's Baby, tannis root was used as part of a ritual in Rosemary's Baby. It's been a long time since I've seen the movie, so I'm not going to be able to recall the scene exactly. I looked it up, and my understanding is that tannis root can also be referred to as the devil's pepper, something to that effect. So I found that to be a little interesting. Sgt. Pepper, the devil's pepper, an ingredient that's used in occult rituals and ceremonies. What was Crowley? He was an occultist who performed rituals and ceremonies. So, maybe there's a tie there. But again, that's just conjecture on my part.
Well, the recent picture of one of the princesses of England has her dressed in the same dress as Rosemary's Baby's mom. The red dress with the white collar. Yes.
Right. Well, they filmed it in the Dakota, and John Lennon lived in the Dakota. And if you look at the poster for Rosemary's Baby, we have Mia Farrow. She has her head down on the ground, horizontally. And if you take John Lennon's Imagine album, you have the same imagery, almost exactly the same as the poster for Rosemary's Child.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's very weird. It's very, very weird.
Weird
I can send you the picture if you like.
Destiny. That's the third definition.
Is it?
Weird, yes, the weird sisters of the Greek tragedies. I love the word when people call me that. They think it's an insult, and I laugh and say, you have no idea.
Yeah. So where else did you want to go? Vivian Stanshall, right?
Yes.
So, all right, so in the book, he tells us that he played the character of Vivian Stanshall in the Bonzo Dog Band with Neil Innes. Now, for those of you who don't know who Neil Innes is, this is interesting, right? But Neil Innes was the brainchild behind the Ruddles, which was the parody band parodying the Beatles. They did a movie, All You Need Is Cash. I believe it was released back in 1976. Neil and team put together a bunch of songs that were very, very Beatles sounding. And, what they did was they took bits and pieces of different Beatles songs and they put them into the Ruddles songs. And it's a brilliant piece of work and it's a lot of fun. To be honest with you, I love the Ruddles music. I have a couple of their albums. So there's 2 albums I've got. I think it's the one from the movie, and then there's another one. It's a greatest hits called Archaeology or something. So, but a really good listen. So Billy tells us that he was in the Bonzo Dog Band with Neil Innes, and he has blondish reddish hair and he has a lighter complexion. He's very Scottish looking. Let's just put it that way. He's very Scottish looking. When you look at the pictures of Billy when he's playing a Stanshall character, and I have these images, I've done presentations on this. If you take a look at the eyes, it appears that Stanshall has this lazy eye, his left eye, relative to his right eye. So when I was going through the book and I was trying to confirm whether he actually played the character of Vivian Stanshall in the Bonzos, and by the way, there was another Vivian Stanshall that Billy hired outside of the Bonzos. So for people who are listening to this and saying, Vivian Stanshall died in 1995, the Vivian Stanshall that Billy hired, who was an actor and a musician, his name was Victor, that died in 1995. Billy played in the Bonzos, Victor did not. But Billy hired Victor so that his McCartney and Stanshall character could coexist. Otherwise, he would have the Batman and Bruce Wayne phenomenon, right? You never see them in the same room together. So anyway, to get back to my story here.
We're talking Victor Hayden, right?
Oh, I don't know if his name is Hayden. See, I went by Wikipedia and it says Victor Stanshall. So it'd be Victor, quote, Vivian Stanshall. Do I think his real last name, his surname is Stanshall? No. And it's very easy to change your names. It's a legal process, and you can get your name changed. I think it's possible that Victor changed whatever his original last name was to Stanshall, because the book tells us he was totally into the part. In fact, he loved being Vivian Stanshall so much that that's who he became. Sometimes people will write me and say, I think actually you wrote me and you said that a friend of yours said, oh, well, I ran into him in a pub or a bar. A number of people have wrote me and said, oh, I ran into Vivian Stanshall in a pub or a bar. Well, the Vivian Stanshall that they ran into in the pub was Victor. It wasn't Billy. It was Victor. So in any case, so when you look at the Stanshall, Billy's version of Stanshall out of the Bonzos, he's got this thing going with his eye, his left eye. It looks like it's, a little lazy and it's a little bit wandering. So when I wanted to test the waters to see if this claim was true, I found images of Billy as Paul McCartney with the exact same eye issue. So you have to ask yourself, okay, so what are the odds that these guys, if they were two different people, would have the same eye configuration going on, where the left eye appears a bit wandering or lazy? And so when I continued my research, I found images where it was very clear that, in my analysis, that they are the same person, because I was able to look at the ears, I was able to look at the nose, the forehead, the eye, obviously, and the whole facial structure, because the facial structure, Billy's facial structure is much longer than Paul McCartney's, biological Paul's. Billy's is very oval, Paul's is more round. Now, the reason why that left eye seems like it's wandering or it's drifting is because Billy is blind in his right eye. And this was a discovery made by my colleague, my fellow researcher and friend, Sally Whitty. Sally is blind in one eye. She's blind in her left eye. Billy's blind in his right eye. So she was watching video and looking at images, and then it dawned on her. She says, wait, something's going on with his eye, because it looks a lot like what my eye does. So the reason why Billy's left eye looks like it's wandering or drifting sometimes is because the right eye is not syncing with the left eye. There are times when the right eye is not in perfect alignment with his good eye, his left eye. So what happens is the right eye might be looking straight ahead and the left eye might be looking a little left, and therefore it looks like the left eye is wandering or drifting. But what's really happening is it's the right eye that is not tracking with his good eye. His blind eye is not tracking with his good eye. Now, what's interesting is, some people, they doubt this, they question this, but to me, after Sally took me through the evidence and I looked for myself, I think it's conclusive that he does not have sight in his right eye. Now, to back it up, what Billy did, he did an interview, I think it was on CBS or ABC. They were talking to him about this exhibit where they allegedly found these photos that biological Paul McCartney took back in 1964. They were these lost photos, and so they put an exhibit up to display these photos, and it was called Eyes of the Storm. So Billy's being interviewed on one of the American television shows. They're looking at this one particular picture. And so the interviewer says, well, it really takes an eye to take that type of picture. So Billy looks, he leans forward, and he goes, yes, my left eye. His left eye is the eye that he has sight in. We think that Billy was giving us a nod to the discovery, saying, you guys got it, you figured it out. Yeah, I am blind in my right eye. And that was his way of validating it. And what Masons do, they have this technique, it's referred to as masterfully speaking. So masterfully speaking is being able to tell the truth, but they do it in an encoded way. And so Billy did that in an encoded way. It's the same thing he did when I did my analysis and I concluded that the Beatles did not write all their own music and did not play on all of their recorded tracks. And the way I concluded that, we're not going to be able to get into it with this discussion, but I analyzed the Rubber Soul sessions. And quickly, once I was going through the official narrative, I thought, well, no, this could not have worked this way. So basically, what the official story was telling us, that the Beatles came into the Rubber Soul sessions. They entered the studio on October 11th. They began recording on October 12th. and they finished up on November 11th. So let's just say 30 days. So in that 30-day period of time, they essentially wrote, learned, rehearsed, arranged, and recorded 16 brand new songs in a 30-day period of time. They came in with a blank sheet of paper. Okay, it's very important to understand this. Some people want to argue that they had bits and pieces of this song or that song, and the official narrative will say that they had, some of We Can Work It Out, they had a little bit of this and a little bit of that. But having a little bit of something when you're coming into a studio doesn't mean you have something. You still have to work it. And my argument with people is, okay, so pick the number of songs that you think that they had completed coming into the Rubber Soul sessions. Do you think it's 2 songs? Do you think it's 3 songs? Do you think it's 4 songs? Because I'm going to tell you that whether you're writing from scratch, whether it's 10 songs, 12 songs, 14 songs, or 16 songs, that's a lot. And I'm going to tell you that it's not possible. I don't care whether it's 10 songs or 16 songs, it's not possible. But in any case, I concluded that they did not do what the official narrative told us that they did for Rubber Soul. So what wound up happening was, what I concluded is, all of the songs were pre-written, all of the songs were pre-recorded by session musicians, and this was all being facilitated and put together by their producer, George Martin. And so when the Beatles showed up in 1965, on October 11th of 1965, to, quote, record Rubber Soul, what they were really doing was recording the vocals only, because the songs were written and the music was already recorded. What happened was, George Martin would cue up the songs, and I would think undoubtedly they had guide vocals that were already recorded, so that the Beatles, John Lennon and Paul McCartney and George Harrison, could learn the melody lines of the songs. So they would listen to the guide vocals, and then, okay, got it. They would overdub their vocals in place of the guide vocal. So that's what the Beatles did for 30 days. They did the vocals only on Rubber Soul, and I concluded that that was the model that was used for the Beatles throughout the 1962 through 1966 period. And then after 1966, when Billy, who replaced Paul McCartney in September of 1966, when he took over the band, his first album was Sgt. Pepper. Billy managed things differently than George Martin. George Martin stuck to outside songwriters, ghostwriters, and session musicians, whereas Billy wanted to bring John Lennon and George Harrison to have a bigger role in the actual songwriting and playing on the recorded tracks. So I concluded that from Sgt. Pepper on, but in particular I really want to say from the White Album on, we hear more of John and George of their own material, writing their own material, and playing on more of the recorded tracks, although the Beatles were still utilizing ghostwriters and session musicians even during the Billy period, 67 through 70. Billy validated that premise as well because he was on another talk show, and I think this was ABC, and he was talking about Let It Be, the Get Back sessions. And he said to record all of those songs, 14 songs in 30 days, or 12 to 14 songs in 30 days, was quite impossible. So that was, I looked at that as another nod, another acknowledgement, validating the research that I have put forth. I mean, why else would he say that?
Could you run down the list like Andy White played drums, and then all the recognized, verifiable online names and their instruments, and then run down the list of session musicians that are not credited anywhere that you've run across?
That's a tough one because that stuff is held very close to the vest. So I'll just go through some of the drummers to start. We know Andy White drummed on Love Me Do and P.S. I Love You, going back to 1962. That's acknowledged by the official narrative. George Martin was a professional. He was a professional producer. He was a composer. He had the George Martin Orchestra, so he was going to use top flight, top shelf musicians. So there's an interview with between George and, quote, Paul McCartney, or Billy, and in that discussion, Billy says, well, I know that you were used to using session players, and George Martin said yes. So I believe that Andy White drummed on more than just those 2 songs. I think it's possible that Andy White probably drummed on a lot of the songs on the first album, Please Please Me. Then I had a relative of the late, great session musician Ronnie Verrill reach out to me back in 4 years ago, 2020. They told me that Ronnie Verrill, who was her relative, also drummed on Beatles songs. So there's 2 right there. And then we have Bernard Purdie. And Bernard caused quite a controversy. Going back to the late 1970s, I believe in 1978 is when he first came out and said that he drummed on 21 Beatles songs from the early period. I think he was referring to, if I remember one of the interviews, the first 3 albums. So that would be Please Please Me with the Beatles and A Hard Day's Night. So that would mean that Bernard drummed on 21 of the songs that were on those first 3 albums. And maybe he drummed on songs on albums after A Hard Day's Night. Bernard, in an interview in 2004, it was a Red Bull interview, he said there were 4 drummers on the Beatles' music, and he was talking about the early period. So when I talk about the early period, we're talking about 1962 through 1966. He said there were 4 drummers, and Ringo was not one of them. Then I have a clip from Glenn Campbell. Now, Glenn Campbell played for the Wrecking Crew. So the Wrecking Crew, for those that don't know, watch the documentary. It's online. You can get it on YouTube. You can get it on Netflix. The Wrecking Crew were the musicians behind the music in the 1960s and 1970s. So all those artists that you think were on those records, they were not on those records. In fact, Bernard Purdy in that 2004 interview, Red Bull interview, says that 98% of the artists that you think were playing on their records were not playing on those records. It was session players that were on those records, and Bernard being one of those session players. But Glenn Campbell, who was an unbelievable guitar player and part of the Wrecking Crew and played on many, many albums. In fact, he was touring with the Beach Boys when they went out to play. He was part of the Beach Boy ensemble when they were playing live. He introduced the band Cream. So Cream would be Jack Bruce, Ginger Baker, and Eric Clapton. Now, all of those guys were session musicians themselves. Eric Clapton played on many, many records as a session guitarist, as did Ginger Baker and Jack Bruce, the bass player. And when he introduced Cream, he said that they were these top-notch session players, and they played on many records. They played on Beatle records, the Rolling Stones, Smothers Brothers records, and he named off a number of other acts in which Cream played on. And this introduction that Glenn did, this was done, I think it was June of 1968. So in June of 1968, he's telling us that members of Cream were playing on Beatle records. Very interesting, right? It's not until September of 1968 that we're told that George Harrison approached Eric Clapton to play on While My Guitar Gently Weeps, to play the lead guitar part. So Glenn Campbell is telling us that Cream played on Beatle records 3 months before George Harrison asked Eric Clapton to play lead on While My Guitar Gently Weeps. So what does that tell us? That tells us that Cream, not just Eric Clapton, were playing on Beatle records. I mean, that's what it says to me. Then there was a post by Jimmy Page. I just saw it recently. I think it was on Instagram, I think. I have a copy of it. And Jimmy said that he played on many records as a session musician. Now, that's what Jimmy Page was. He was a session player. He started his session work at age 17. And in that post, he said that he played on many records, including the Beatles' Hard Day's Night album. Now, people wanted to argue with me and say, no, he meant he played on the instrumentals from the soundtrack of the album. And I said, well, that's not what he said. He didn't say he played on the soundtrack of the Hard Day's Night film or the soundtrack pieces to the Hard Day's Night album that was released in the United States on the United Artists label. In the United States, we got some Beatles songs mixed in with the soundtrack music. And people were trying to tell me that that's what he was talking about. I said, no, I don't think so. Beatles' official releases were not the U.S. releases. It was not Capitol. It was not VJ. It was not United Artists. It was the EMI Parlophone releases. And on the Hard Day's Night album, released in the UK, their third UK release, it was all original Beatle music. If you logic through this thing, it sure read to me like Jimmy Page was saying that he played on Beatle records. And he specifically mentioned A Hard Day's Night. Now, other potential musicians, Vic Flick, great guitar player, session musician, played with the George Martin Orchestra. He actually played on the song Ringo's Theme, the soundtrack from the album, from the film, I should say. That was Vic Flick. He also did the James Bond sounding intro of Help. That was Vic Flick. But I think Vic Flick was playing on a lot of Beatle records. And the fact that he was with the George Martin Orchestra says to me that, in all likelihood, that's definitely the case. Another person would be Big Jim Sullivan. Big Jim Sullivan was another in-demand guitar player. He was also a very, very good sitar player. In fact, Big Jim released 2 sitar albums back in the late 1960s. And if you read Wikipedia, it explains that Big Jim used to visit George Harrison at his home. And I guess we're to conclude that Big Jim was giving him sitar lessons. Well, I believe it's not George Harrison playing sitar on Norwegian Wood from the Rubber Soul album. It's Big Jim Sullivan. Again, we have to bring this back to the music business is a business. And they have their set of resources, skilled session players that are going to be called in to create this music. A producer like George Martin is not going to jerk around in the studio with subpar musicianship. He's just not going to do that. He's got a job to do. So I believe that's what he did. He brought in the session players that he knew, the session players that he had worked with, and that's who we're hearing on those early Beatle albums, especially, like I said, between 62 and 66 until things changed up a little bit, starting with Pepper, especially the White Album going forward through 1970 and into their solo careers. So I hope that answered your question.
Well, there was a comedian that I traced down. I don't remember his name now, but he was the one giving the quote that Ringo wasn't even the best drummer in the Beatles. August 5th of 1966, there's an interview where Paul McCartney reveals that they're not so good and that they don't write between songs. Do you want to run that through? And then you can also touch on either subject.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought that up. So the official narrative tells us, wants the flock to believe that the Beatles were writing music all the time. They were writing music, when they were on vacation. They were writing music on film sets. They were writing music in hotel rooms. They were writing music in the studio while they were gigging. Every waking moment of their life, they were writing music. And that's how come they were so prolific, because nothing mattered more in their life than sitting down and writing music. And so in an August 5th, 1966 interview, this is the same day that their 7th studio album, UK studio album, Revolver, was released, John Lennon and Paul McCartney did an interview at the BBC at Paul McCartney's home. And during that interview, Paul McCartney dropped a number of bombshells. One of them was that they did not write in between albums, he said, normally. Maybe one or two. And because he used the word maybe one or two, maybe could also mean 0. And Paul said, we wrote in great big batches whenever we had to go to the studio to record an album or a film. What he really meant was to do an album, because the songs from the film were really the songs from the album. So just to kind of streamline that a little bit. And during that interview, the BBC interviewer says, well, I always thought it was quite impossible to sit down and bang out 12 songs in short order. How does that work? And John Lennon said, well, it is sometimes quite impossible. So what we're getting from that interview is, well, first of all, Paul McCartney takes the official narrative of them writing music all the time and completely blows it out of the water. He's telling us, well, that's not true. We wrote in great big batches. But his explanation of writing in great big batches creates another problem. And that is, well, how do you do that? How do you sit down and have a situation where you have creativity on demand, where the creative flow and the creative juices are you just turn it on like a switch? How do you do that? Well, for anybody who's a songwriter, anybody who's a musician knows that that's not how it works. You don't sit down and write songs in great big batches. Now, can some songs come quickly? Yes. But other songs can take a long time to come together. He created a problem for the official narrative, but he also created a problem where he didn't explain how the whole writing in batches piece worked. In fact, what they said was that it was very difficult. He said that for the last album, and I think he was referring to Revolver because the interview was on August 5th of 1966. He said with the last album, it took us weeks just to get one song done. Weeks. And you're sitting there and you're scratching your head, at least I was. I'm thinking to myself, okay, Paul, so it took you weeks to get one song written, and we're thinking in terms of Revolver, but you guys banged out 16 songs in 30 days for Rubber Soul? Well, that doesn't make any sense, because 30 days is weeks. In that same interview, he says that they were not very good musicians and they were limited. As a band, they were limited. And in that interview, he also says that they didn't have to show themselves up for the recording of Yesterday. Now, my British listeners said, well, not showing yourself up means not embarrassing yourself. So let's just take it from that angle. So Paul was saying, well, we didn't have to embarrass ourselves for the recording session for Yesterday. What does that mean? I'll tell you what I think it means to me. It means that he didn't play on Yesterday when the official narrative is telling us that he played acoustic guitar. He laid down the acoustic guitar track for the song Yesterday. But in that interview, he's saying, I didn't. And he said, and we didn't have to show ourselves up again. That was his quote. We didn't have to show ourselves up again. So it was a very revealing interview. A lot of people that are Beatle fans and want to argue with me and want to debate me on my research, they don't like that clip. They don't like that clip at all. At all. Because this is not Mike saying this. They're hearing it from the horse's mouth, and that's, they don't want to hear it.
What are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes?
Exactly.
Well, I was going to place myself in this story for a minute. 18 days later, I was born August 28th, 66. And a day later, they quit playing their music. So I was immediately out of a job. And then approximately 2 weeks later after that, the Faustian deed of Paul is dead started as a rumor which has two different pictures of two different people side by side. They are obviously two different people because new Paul is 4 inches taller with blue eyes or brown eyes or green eyes different than Paul's. But the Who said it perfect when they said the parting on the left is now parting on the right, which is his hair.
That's right. The new boss is the same as the old boss. They're talking about the agenda. So when the Who sang about the new boss being the same as the old boss, they're talking about the agenda. The parting on the left, the parting on the right, different guy, but guess what? The agenda stays the same. So, and the Who they knew they were totally on board with the replacement of biological Paul back in 1966. The prevailing conspiracy theory says he was killed in a car crash, but that's just the prevailing conspiracy theory. It's also possible, and I've covered this in my research, that he was a ritual sacrifice based upon a Faustian bargain that Memoirs tells us was performed back in October of 1963. So after their release of their first UK album, Please Please Me, but before their second release with the Beatles, there was a Faustian bargain that was sandwiched in between those two releases. Now, whether that Faustian bargain, whether that's true or not, or it happened, I don't know. I can tell you that I do believe that these Faustian bargains are real. It's called Going to the Crossroads. There's a book titled Lennon Prophecy, written by the author Joseph Niezgoda, and he believes, I should say that he hypothesizes that John Lennon actually entered into a Faustian bargain in December of 1960 in order to launch the Beatles, to put them on the trajectory that they ended up on. Because the Beatles went to Hamburg in August of 1960, no songwriting skills, not very good musicians, in fact, mediocre at best, and I'm probably being kind with that description. And then 3.5 years later, they land in the United States in February of 1964 to conquer America. That was the tagline, the Beatles conquer America. So you have to ask yourself, how does this ragtag bar band with no songwriting abilities and very mediocre musicianship in 3.5 years, they're sitting on the shores of the United States with all of this major media hype behind them, doing major worldwide concerts? Well, I don't know. Seems like maybe something happened.
Toppermost to the poppermost, I think it was said.
Yeah, that's right. So it's a very interesting tale, Julia. Very interesting story.
No, this is perfect because I've heard said that the record companies take their master tapes into a ritual room, I guess, within the building and perform, I guess, prayers or whatever you want to conjure up as an equivalent term, but they pray over the masters and they conjure up whatever spirit goes behind it. Now, if this is the case in all record companies, then how would EMI now translate to Universal Music Group, who is the current head of a lot of these one-eyed Illuminati bands that showcase that?
Yeah, is that a question?
The question is, if EMI was the unseen hand in some ritualistic inclusion, is that same power over the industry today held with the Universal Music Group, who does the Wizard of Oz and all of the things that are referenced in an occult narrative? But they all show one eye. That one eye displays their connection to the Illuminati.
Yes, I mean, I think it's still alive and well. I mentioned earlier that if we look at how music has developed, how much darker it has gotten since the let's say 1960 to current day, and we see all of the satanic overtones, a lot of the choreographing is ritual dancing. We can see this. There are clips on YouTube where that type of choreographed dancing takes place in Masonic lodges. And the person that you're referring to that talked about how Satanism plays into the master tapes, where there was a ritual or a ceremony or some kind of incantation or whatever that took place before the release of an album to embed the Satanism into the actual music. Now, whether somebody believes that or not, that's up to you. According to John Todd, this is the person that made this claim and was in the music industry, that this was done.
Okay, before I forget, what is Stacy's last name? Because I don't remember hearing it. So we can research her research.
Oh, yeah, I don't get into Stacy's last name.
Okay,
She just
that's all
goes
I
by
need to know.
Stacy.
I just wanted to know if there was reason to look into what she's
Yeah,
researching.
some researchers want to fly under the radar because, to be honest with you, this whole topic can be very toxic, especially within the Paul is Dead community itself. I mean, outside the community, by Beatle fans, they don't want to hear this message, what you and I are talking about. And a lot of people within the Paul is Dead community, researchers included, there's a lot of hostility that comes my way because they only want to talk about the replacement of Paul McCartney. That's it. They want to talk about from 1966 going forward. They don't want to talk about pre-1966 and what possibly went on and how the Beatles were manufactured and engineered and how it goes back to Tavistock and the Frankfurt School. How there were ghostwriters and session players and all of this stuff. They don't want to hear that stuff because that's heretical.
Cognitive dissonance.
A lot of people, they want to hold on to the Cinderella story. They want to hold on to the story that was given to us. And I understand, okay? I was there at one time. It's a great story. 4 lads, 4 scousers coming out of Liverpool, middle-class guys, connecting to Brian Epstein, record store owner. He eventually gets them a record contract with EMI Parlophone, and then that leads to unprecedented fame and fortune. Who doesn't love that story? It's a great story. It's not true. That's what I deducted, but it's a great story. It's a Cinderella story. Going back to, like, some researchers really don't want to, who work with me, don't want to put themselves out there because they don't want to deal with all the negativity. They don't want to deal with the hostility.
I always bring attention to things that other people react violently and then usually block me. So anybody that's like that probably has not gotten to this point in the show anyway. And as my first show said, my guest said, well, what if I get nervous and I don't know what to say? I said, don't worry. Nobody's listening anyway. His answer was, then why are we doing this? I said, I don't know. But anyway, we move forward into now.
Well, you're always going to, whenever you're digging into something that cuts across the grain, it cuts across official narratives, it cuts across the indoctrination that people are getting out of their television sets and all of the media and so on, their government and politics. Whenever you cut across the grain, you're going to get backlash because people are indoctrinated. People are conditioned. They're brainwashed to believe certain narratives. And a lot of people are so married to their belief system, there's no budging. And so when you say to them, hey, you know what, I don't think you have everything in your box that you think you do, they become triggered, they become very emotional, and they become very angry. They start lashing out. I see this all the time, all the time.
Well, they say opinion requires no research, no evidence. So it's the lowest form of knowledge you can have. And then by that same token, a belief system is just that. It's a belief system. It doesn't make it real.
Right. Because you believe it doesn't mean it's true. And I tell people that all the time. They'll write me in comments and say, well, I believe. And I said, don't believe. No. It's 2 different things.
Yes, because people tend to research nothing and base their opinion and belief system on a narrative they haven't even really considered.
Oh, I can't tell you how many times, Julia, that I mean, it's so easy to tell when people show up on my channel and they are triggered by the title of the video. So as an example, did the Beatles write all their own music? They didn't even watch the presentation. Their reaction is, of course they did. Why would you even remotely want to question whether the Fab Four wrote all their own music or not? Of course they did. This is not something that we need to look at. So then they write a comment based upon being triggered. And so I say to them, look, watch the presentation. I know you didn't watch it. I know you didn't. Or I can also tell when they've gotten to a certain point in the presentation because their comments are focused on that particular segment. As an example, you brought up the August 5th, 1966 BBC interview where Paul says that they wrote in great big batches and they weren't very good musicians. So I'll get comments that in a 2.5-hour video where that's 15 minutes of the interview or 20 minutes of it, they will major on that. They will dig into that. They will exert all this energy to try to twist what Paul said, to make it something other than what he said, to infuse their own narrative in order to placate their belief system, in order to appease what it is they want to believe. And I'll say to them, well, you didn't get past the first 20 minutes, did you? You know, so that's when they short circuit. And I'm not poking at anybody, okay, folks? That's not my deal. I don't want to poke at anybody. But what I do request, if you're going to come to the channel, watch the presentation. Because if you're not going to watch it and comment, then fair is fair, right? So if you don't have time, I don't have time. So what that means is if you're not going to spend any time taking a look at what it is I put together, but you want to have the ability to comment, well, you know what? Then I have the ability to say no. I want the comments to be constructive. I want value-add comments based upon an evaluation and an assessment of what was presented. Not because you got triggered and you short-circuited, you had an emotional moment. That's not value-add. That's not having an intellectual discussion.
It's an argument.
It's an argument. It's a
We
debate.
have a
It's
clinic
being
for that.
emotional.
Ask Monty Python. The same applies to when an 8-year-old is videotaped asking Buzz Aldrin why we've never been back to the moon, and he says, because we've never been there.
Right.
And then people try to, justify. He even tries to explain it, but the reality is that's what he said. And the same with Olivia Harrison calling Paul McCartney Billy is a video, and a whole
Right.
compilation of examples just like that.
On that clip where Olivia Harrison says, hello, Billy, it was at the premiere for the concert for George, and she says, hello, Billy. And I've got people writing me saying, no, she said, hello, babe. I'm like, what? You think she said babe?
That's funny. Gaslighting.
I'm not kidding you. Go to that video and page down, and I'm like, you got babe out of that? No. You have to go get a hearing test.
Or a thinking test.
She said Billy. So anyway, so I don't know. We're running low on time here, Julia.
I see that you've run 15 minutes past the 2:30, and
That's
an
okay.
hour and something above the 4, so I know you have somewhere to be. And it sounds like we've exhausted at least this portion of the conversation. Now, is there any possibility I can coerce you, pay you, or whatever to send that audio track to me as soon as possible?
Yeah, I'll send it to you as soon as we're done.
So I am at your mercy for thanking you. I have nothing but the most utmost respect for your research.
Oh, thank you. I'm going to send you this audio now before I head out.
Okay, great. I hope you have a great day with your daughter. Tell her I said hello.
I will. Thank you.
Thank you.